the Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can I remind members that social distancing measures are in place in the chamber and right across the campus. And the next item of business is a statement by Kate Forbes on the Scottish Budget 2021-22. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Kate Forbes for up to 30 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's budget comes almost a year after the first case of COVID-19 was notified in Scotland. The pandemic has shaken our society and our economy to the core. Every life has been impacted, every single life lost has been a tragedy. Livelihoods have been upended. Frontline services have responded in remarkable ways. And of course, our collective fight to overcome the virus continues. The exceptional circumstances require an exceptional response. This budget provides for continuity in our urgent work to control the virus and protect our economy and NHS, whilst the vaccine is delivered as quickly and as safely as possible. It's not just the pandemic that has taken its toll on Scotland's economy. The wrecking ball of a dismal Brexit deal is compounding matters. So today's budget will help to bring much needed support and stability to ensure our economy recovers and we protect those who have been hit the hardest. Our approach continues to target support in the immediate term, as well as tracking a course over the coming year to build a fairer, stronger and greener economy. Fundamentally, it focuses on 3 key priorities: creating jobs and investing in sustainable recovery, responding to the health pandemic and tackling inequalities. This is a time of great fiscal uncertainty. In the absence of a UK budget, much of the information we need to plan with certainty is missing. We must persevere with a budget based on a partial settlement, left waiting until the UK budget to see the full hand being dealt to us. I have repeatedly welcomed the additional COVID funding, largely borrowed, provided by the UK Government. I do so again. But I also have a duty as Finance Secretary to make the case forcefully when I believe more is required. There is £21 billion sitting in the UK COVID reserve. Our share of that funding would help meet the ongoing needs of our businesses, our NHS and other public services. And in the interests of providing certainty and based on the balance of consequentials received to date, I have made a prudent funding assumption and allocated £500 million against what we expect to flow to us from that COVID reserve next year. This will help make the budget process more transparent and aid parliamentary scrutiny of our funding decisions. I've written to the Chancellor this week setting out the Scottish Government's priorities for the UK budget and seeking clarity and flexibility on several matters of importance to Scotland. Presiding Officer, given the particular interaction between this year's and next year's budget, I'll touch on the 2020-21 position as we approach financial year end. Last month, I set out how COVID funding was being allocated in full. Following my assessment of the latest position and confirmation of an additional £400 million of consequential funding, I have already confirmed further 2020-21 funding of £300 million for business support, including payments from the Strategic Framework Business Fund to the end of this financial year, one-off top-ups to the grant support for hospitality, retail and leisure businesses, comparable support for island businesses and increased funding for the taxi and wedding sector funds. There is also £85 million for education recovery and £30 million for university student hardship. On Monday, councils paid out millions in framework funding and sector top-ups, significantly more than the figures published earlier this month. And since Boxing Day, payments have been made to tens of thousands of businesses. That builds on the 383,000 business awards made since the beginning of the pandemic, valued at over £2.3 billion. Alongside that, we are filling the gaps in support through sector-specific funding, with funding now available for taxi drivers, brewers, travel agents, indoor football clubs, events and a variety of businesses in the wedding sector, from florists to photographers. I know that businesses will continue to need support for as long as they need to close, and they want certainty about the future. I can confirm today that the Strategic Framework Business Fund will continue to support businesses beyond the end of this financial year, should funding from the UK Government be forthcoming. And I can confirm two further measures. One, a doubling of the discretionary fund for local authorities to £60 million to distribute as they wish, and a commitment to pay February grants at level 4, irrespective of what levels are confirmed over the next month. Presiding Officer, local government has been at the forefront in distributing grants, supporting communities and responding to the pandemic. Last year, the Scottish Government and COSLA agreed the details of a scheme that, estimated at £90 million, would compensate councils for the loss of income from sales, fees and charges due to the pandemic. Today, I am increasing that allocation to £200 million. When added to the £49 million previously announced, the total support for councils' losses this year is now up to an additional £249 million. I'm writing today to the Finance and Constitution Committee with the full 2020-21 allocation details, which confirms that every single penny has been allocated. Yesterday's GDP figures show that as a result of the restrictions we have had to put in place to control the virus, our economy is now 7.1% smaller than it was pre-COVID-19, while over the same period, the UK economy has shrunk by 8.5%. We've largely tracked the rest of the UK economy over the course of the pandemic, with a negligible difference in labour market and GDP statistics, but yesterday's figures suggest a widening gap in the impact on the Scottish and UK economies. The Scottish Fiscal Commission's forecasts published today show a difficult outlook. The current lockdown measures to suppress the new COVID variant will likely reverse some of the fragile economic recovery seen in the summer, with GDP forecast to fall 5.2% in the first quarter of 2021. The vaccine rollout and anticipated easing of measures mean the economy is expected to return to growth across 2021-22 as a whole. Yet the Commission still expects longer-term damage and does not expect GDP to return to pre-pandemic levels until 2024. The SFC also forecasts unemployment to increase to 7.6% in Q2 this year. In line with currently announced UK Government policy, that forecast is based on the assumption that the job retention scheme ends at the end of April without a replacement scheme. Now, I do not underestimate either the cost or the benefit of the job retention scheme, but it is a stark reminder that if it ends prematurely, the impact on jobs and livelihoods will be severe. So the Chancellor must extend the job retention scheme, and he must do so before the UK budget in March to give businesses sufficient time to plan ahead, because good jobs and viable businesses depend on this. Members will note that the Scottish Fiscal Commission projections published today take into account the current period of lockdown. The most recent UK projection is from November and does not reflect the current lockdowns across the UK. That timing difference will inevitably cause some challenges for our budget through the fiscal framework. However, as Richard Hughes from the OBR said to the Finance Committee yesterday, UK GDP fell by less than expected in November, suggesting that we have become better adapted to dealing with lockdown conditions. But the latest restrictions will inevitably have an impact on the economy. The updated SFC projection for Scotland sees growth fall in the first quarter of this year, whilst the OBR had been forecasting growth in its November publication. This difference does not reflect a difference in our underlying economic performance, but rather differences in timing, and will likely disappear when new OBR projections are published in March. But it does mean that the technical conditions under the fiscal framework for the release of additional reserve and borrowing flexibilities following an economic shock have been met. The UK Government has confirmed these flexibilities are now available to me, and I will use them to support our recovery from COVID-19. These extra flexibilities are welcome, although they are constrained and temporary. They do not change the fact that the Scottish Government cannot borrow at its own hand to fund spending in response to COVID-19 or support the economy in the way that countries around the world have done. This is a time for certainty and stability and helping businesses and households as far as we can. With limited resources, we must target those who need our help the most. I'm delivering that stability and certainty that taxpayers need, with targeted support for the individuals and the businesses most impacted. This is a package of tax measures that will support our recovery and renewal. Significant changes to Scottish income tax were implemented in 2018-19 to deliver a fairer and more progressive five-band system. That structure will remain unchanged, with the starter, basic and higher rates band all increasing by inflation. The top rate threshold will remain frozen at £150,000. This will see all Scottish taxpayers pay slightly less income tax next year than they will this year based on their current income. In addition to this, a majority will continue to pay less income tax than if they lived in other parts of the UK. Alongside record investment in public services, that is a key part of making Scotland an attractive place to live and work. On land and buildings transaction tax, the temporary change to the residential nil rate band introduced in July supported the housing market at a difficult time and contributed to a robust recovery throughout the year to date. The housing market reopened in June and has continued to operate uninterrupted since. That change was always meant to be temporary. The ceiling of the nil rate band will return to £145,000 from the 1st of April as intended, with no other changes to rates or bands. First-time buyer relief, however, will remain in place, saving first-time buyers up to £600 and meaning that an estimated 8 out of 10 first-time buyers will pay no tax at all. The additional dwelling supplement rate will remain at 4%. However, recognising the long-standing calls for change, we intend to consult early in the next Parliament on reforms to the ADS. Non-residential LBTT rates and bands remain unchanged. And finally, on Scottish landfill tax, the standard rate of Scottish landfill tax will rise to £96.70 per tonne and the lower rate to £3.10 per tonne. At a time when the people of Scotland are dealing with the significant economic and social impacts of the pandemic, these tax policies deliver certainty and stability. Based on the most up-to-date forecast from the SFC and the OBR, the net contribution from devolved taxes in 2021-22 to the Scottish budget will be £539 million. In addition to this, we've used our limited borrowing and reserve powers to their maximum effect. In total, that means that the Scottish budget will be over £1.7 billion bigger than it otherwise would have been. Presiding Officer, we have always been rightly proud of the world-class care provided by our NHS, but during the pandemic, in the toughest circumstances imaginable, our inspirational NHS workers have worked tirelessly. When the history of this pandemic is written, our NHS and social care staff will be recognised as the undisputed heroes that they are. And I'm sure I speak for everyone in this chamber, everyone in the country, in fact, when I offer them our heartfelt thanks. To support their efforts in 2021-22, we will invest over £16 billion in the health and sport portfolio, an increase of over £800 million to the core budget, and an additional £869 million to support our response to COVID-19, including vaccinations and test and protect. That includes investment in primary care of £1.9 billion. And it will bring our total investment in social care and integration to over £883 million in 2021-22. I want to draw attention to two critical elements of the health budget. The first is that we will provide £145.3 million funding next year for alcohol and drugs. That's an increase of £50 million on this year, specifically for our national mission to reduce drugs deaths as part of our 5-year £250 million commitment. Secondly, we know that the pandemic has taken a huge toll on mental health, and so next year's investment in mental health will exceed £1.1 billion. This will underpin our continued approach to improving mental health services and support for children, young people and adults, including child and adolescent mental health services. The social harms of COVID-19 have exacerbated poverty and inequality, highlighting the importance of driving progress towards our statutory targets to reduce and ultimately eradicate child poverty by 2030. We're delivering a direct programme of action to meet those targets across 2018 to 2022, backed by the £50 million Tackling Child Poverty Fund, which this budget confirms we will deliver in full. The ambitious use of our new welfare powers to tackle child poverty includes significant investment in our game-changing Scottish Child Payment of an expected £68 million next year, with payments starting next month, part of a total of almost £3.6 billion for social security. Our public sector pay policy will continue its progressive and restorative approach, focused on addressing low pay. The UK Government's ill-judged pay freeze has a material impact on our block grant, within which we must balance reward and affordability of public sector pay. We'll continue to adopt the real living wage, applying the increased rate of £9.50 per hour, guaranteeing a minimum 3% increase for those on salaries up to £25,000 via a £750 cash underpin, with those on higher salaries receiving a 1% rise capped at £800 above £80,000. Negotiations are underway in our NHS on the future of Agenda for Change, and I will work with the Cabinet Secretary for Health to deliver for our NHS workforce. The most enduring way to tackle inequality and break the intergenerational poverty cycle is, of course, through education. In 2021-22, we will provide £2.7 billion across the education and skills budget to deliver on this ambition, alongside the significant funding for education delivered through the local government settlement. That includes almost £1.9 billion for the Scottish Funding Council to fund our university and college sector, including £700 million for colleges and over £1.1 billion for universities. It's vital that we continue to invest strongly in our world-class institutions and provide students with the best opportunities. Turning to justice, the budget provides significant extra funding to help deal with the backlog in criminal justice caseloads caused by the pandemic. We will provide a total funding settlement of £1.3 billion for the Scottish Police Authority, including an uplift of £60 million in the resource budget, surpassing our commitment to deliver a £100 million boost by 2021 and eliminating the deficit in the police budget. Keeping public transport options open remains vital to our recovery, backed by investment next year of over £1.6 billion across bus and rail services. That will help to ensure a viable alternative to private transport for more people, further reducing our reliance on cars, providing a cleaner form of mass transport, in addition to promoting the wide benefits of our 20-minute neighbourhood ambitions. We'll also deliver a national concessionary travel scheme for free bus travel for under-19s in the coming year. And we will continue to support transformational change to our streetscapes with a 5-year commitment to maintain the active travel budget at a record high of £100.5 million per year. I said earlier that local government had been at the forefront of our response to COVID, and I remain extremely grateful to local government colleagues, many of whom have worked night and day to manage grant funding, welfare support and maintain statutory services throughout lockdown. We will make available to local government a total funding package amounting to £11.6 billion for 2021-22, including a £245.6 million increase in core revenue funding and an additional £259 million of non-recurring COVID funding. That is a total additional revenue funding of more than £500 million. Within that, the settlement includes additional funding of £59 million to complete the expansion of early learning and childcare to 1140 hours, £72.6 million for investment in health and social care, and £7.7 million to support the inter-island ferries in Shetland, Orkney and Argyll and Bute, meeting their revenue ask in full, as well as extending the timetable and RET on Orkney's inter-island ferries. This settlement also allows councils to join us in financially supporting households who will undoubtedly be struggling as a result of the social and economic impacts of the pandemic. Just as we have chosen not to increase tax rates, ensuring people pay no more than last year, I have taken the significant step of offering funding to councils who choose to freeze council tax, providing financial reassurance to families who are struggling. That additional funding is equivalent to £90 million for councils, or a 3% rise, with inflation at 0.5%, and that more than fully compensates local authorities who choose to freeze council tax. That takes the increase for core revenue services to £335.6 million, and when added to the non-recurring COVID funding of £259 million, provides a total increase for local government of £594.6 million in 2021-22. I've also confirmed a further increase of £110 million over previously announced plans for the Lost Income Scheme for local government. Presiding Officer, while the pandemic's profound effect on our economy requires constant support, it also requires us to plan and deliver a strong, fair and green recovery in the long term. The future of our public services depends on the resilience and the strength of our economy. And so, if this budget must achieve anything, it must set the groundwork for economic recovery. Today, I set out a plan to deliver that. A plan which provides for ongoing business support, tackles unemployment, helps businesses emerge stronger and invests in long-term growth. Leadership matters, and our enterprise agencies must have the resources they require to play a leading role in the recovery. The collective resource budget for the 3 enterprise agencies in the Highlands, the south of Scotland and across Scotland will increase by more than 12%. The budget builds on the significant package of labour market interventions with a total investment of £1.1 billion in employability and skills support. That includes an initial additional investment of £125 million for the Young Person's Guarantee, the National Transition Training Fund and broader skill and employability support. The Young Person's Guarantee will help achieve our ambition that within 2 years, every young person will have the opportunity to study, to take up an apprenticeship, a job or work experience or participate in formal volunteering. Today's budget allocates £230.9 million to Skills Development Scotland to work with partners across this vital agenda, and it also sees the launch of the first phase of our 5-year £100 million Green Jobs Fund and a commitment to establish a Green Jobs Workforce Academy. And across Scotland, we will invest over £230 million to ensure that our diverse and evolving cultural heritage is valued, nurtured and celebrated, protecting thousands of jobs in the culture and heritage sectors. Presiding Officer, we must invest for growth. The Infrastructure Investment Plan, which will be published in full next week, will outline a pipeline of projects that drive Scotland's resilience, driving inclusive, net zero and sustainable growth. The plan will be key to the success of the National Mission for Jobs, offering a robust pipeline of work that will help stimulate the green recovery, providing good, job-stimulating supply chains and building market confidence. The Capital Spending Review will set out budgets for 5 years, confirming that we will deliver our national infrastructure mission in full to increase annual investment in infrastructure by £1.5 billion by 2025, supporting 45,000 full-time equivalent jobs across the period. These efforts are enhanced by the work of the Scottish National Investment Bank, which we will capitalise with £2 billion, with over £200 million for investment in 2021-22. Next year, we will provide funding of £210 million for cities investment and strategy, and that will continue our work with regional partners to progress all deals not yet in delivery, with the aim of concluding full deals for all regions, urban and rural, by the end of 2022. COVID has further underlined the value of a safe, secure and affordable home, and our homes will also now be somewhere many of us work from. We're providing more than £800 million for housing in the budget. Building on our achievement of having delivered almost 97,000 affordable homes since 2007, I'm allocating funding of more than £711 million to the Affordable Housing Supply Programme. Capital investment will inject confidence in our economy, but it will also help to meet our statutory commitment to be a net zero society by 2045. Our carbon taxonomy shows nearly 37%, or over £1.9 billion, of our capital investment is low carbon. And as we look to Glasgow hosting the COP26 summit in November, we want to inspire global action and demonstrate that Scotland is a world leader in green and renewable technologies. The programme for government and our recent climate change plan update together outlined a £2 billion low carbon fund over the next Parliament, central to which is investment of almost £1.6 billion in heat and energy efficiency in our homes and buildings. Through the fund, we will also begin a 5-year £50 million programme of investment to regenerate Scotland's vacant and derelict land. That will help put abandoned land to use across our communities. This includes creating community gardens to nurture well-being, provide a local food supply and improve biodiversity, or creating space for community renewables projects, low-carbon affordable housing, urban farms, woodland and green spaces. Presiding Officer, I strongly believe in investing in economic recovery in every part of the country, including rural areas. Recognising the acute impact of the pandemic on our rural communities, we will double the Rural Tourism Infrastructure Fund, helping tourist attractions and communities make improvements to cope with increased visitors. Our £801 million investment in agricultural support will offer much-needed stability to our farmers, our crofters, our land managers, and help ensure our agriculture sector plays a leading role in our transition to net zero. Over the next 5 years, an additional £150 million has been allocated for woodland and forestry through the Low Carbon Fund, supporting a 50% increase in tree planting and woodland creation from 12,000 hectares this year to 18,000 hectares by the middle of the decade. And our peatland restoration spend will increase by 10% as part of a 10-year £250 million commitment. Digital connectivity was important pre-pandemic, but now, as a result of the changes in how we work, shop and socialise due to COVID-19, it's absolutely fundamental to our future prosperity. The review I commissioned from Mark Logan has provided an industry-led blueprint to establish Scotland as a world-class hub for tech startups, and it's rightly drawn wide acclaim. To help deliver that ambitious agenda, we are providing an additional £7 million next year. And to bring more people into the digital world, we'll invest almost £100 million in digital connectivity. That includes funding for our Reaching 100% programme and for improved mobile coverage through delivery of 4G and 5G infrastructure, ensuring that no part of Scotland is excluded. Presiding Officer, the last piece of the plan to support businesses and to drive economic recovery is our policy on non-domestic rates. I know how crucial this year's targeted 100% relief from non-domestic rates has been to retail, hospitality and leisure businesses. The extension of this relief to avoid a cliff edge in support was the #1 ask of businesses. The absence of clarity on UK Government NDR policy has undermined our ability to continue this relief. I've been clear that the only way I can replicate that relief in full is if there is additional funding from the UK Government. The UK Spending Review provided £11.5 million as a result of NDR policy decisions. Contrasted with the over £900 million it would cost to extend the relief, those consequentials are entirely insufficient. However, I cannot and I will not leave Scottish businesses trying to plan without certainty. So I am committing now to extend the 100% relief for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses for a further 3 months into 2021-22, funded from the money reimbursed by supermarkets and other retailers. I continue to urge the UK Government to bring forward an extension to their equivalent relief, and should they do so, I will use the funding generated to match their extension. Together with other reliefs, including the expanded Fresh Start scheme to incentivise the use of empty buildings and the Small Business Bonus scheme, we are offering a total reliefs package worth almost £1 billion in this budget. And there is still more I want to do to help our businesses. The UK and the Welsh Governments have frozen their non-domestic rates poundage. I don't intend to do the same. Instead, in an unprecedented step, in a non-revaluation year, I am reducing it to 49p. That will be the lowest poundage available anywhere in the UK, saving ratepayers over £120 million compared to previously published plans. Let nobody doubt, this is a government that listens and acts when it is most needed. Presiding Officer, we have been through so much as a country. Our recovery may be long and it will be hard, and we cannot guarantee that there won't be more tough times ahead. But throughout these dark times, we've never given up hope. Hope for a better future, for a healthier, greener, fairer society. And now, with large-scale vaccination focused firstly on the most vulnerable, there is some light at the end of the tunnel. This budget seeks to build on that hope, and by focusing on how we continue to protect, to recover, to rebuild and to renew our country, it seeks to make that light at the end of the tunnel shine that little bit brighter. Thank you.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement, and I can allow around 60 minutes for that. Would those members who wish to ask a question please press the request to speak buttons, and I first of all call on Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of her statement, and can I take this opportunity on behalf of these benches to congratulate her on the recent happy news of her engagement. It's good, Presiding Officer, to see her recognising the benefits of being in a union. Now, Presiding Officer, our view is very clear that we need today a budget that focuses 100% on managing the pandemic and our economic recovery thereafter. We will measure all the announcements in the budget today against the essential test of whether they will assist efforts in that respect, and in particular help protect jobs and safeguard our economy over the coming year. And we will reject any plans to waste precious resources, money or time on campaigning for another divisive independence referendum. We need a budget that is about building up, not breaking up. Presiding Officer, the background to this budget is that the Scottish Government has seen unprecedented support from the UK Treasury over the past year. We have a guaranteed minimum additional spend of £8.6 billion in the current financial year to support the NHS and individuals and businesses across Scotland. And that, of course, is in addition to the billions in direct support that have been provided through the furlough scheme and other Treasury initiatives. And with all that money, it is essential that the Scottish Government get the cash out the door to needy businesses and individuals across Scotland who have been crying out for it. And that support carries forward to next year, with an additional £1.3 billion to help manage the pandemic and a £1.1 billion increase in the general budget for the coming year. Even without additional COVID resources, the budget for the coming year will be the highest in the history of devolution, giving the Scottish Government more money to spend than at any previous point in history. And all this is possible because of the broad shoulders of the UK Government supporting people, businesses and public services in Scotland in these challenging times. And unlike governments in so many other places in the world, this Scottish Government has its income protected through the fiscal framework, meaning that so long as tax revenues in Scotland perform in line with those elsewhere in the UK, there will be no cuts in the budgets required. Now, when it comes to the detail of the budget for the coming year, we have been very clear that there should be no new income tax rises. Consumer spending, following the easing of restrictions, will be a major driver in future economic growth, and any income tax increases would hold that recovery back. And in that respect, the announcements today on income tax are welcome, although, of course, we're only at the first stage in the budget process. We need to see COVID support provided for businesses into next year. We need assurances that relevant business grants will continue for so long as restrictions remain in force, and we need to see a guarantee that the existing 100% rates relief for leisure, hospitality and tourism businesses and retail businesses will continue, not just for 3 months, but for 12 months. The Scottish Government has been given the funds already to make that happen, and it should be an absolute priority for their budget. Presiding Officer, we know the pandemic has put further strain on our councils, as many individuals, families and businesses have become dependent on council services. We have set out our view that we need to see fair funding for our councils so they receive a set proportion of the Scottish Government's budget. For years, the SNP have underfunded local government to finance their own priorities, and so in order to start the process of moving to fairer funding, we need to see the percentage increase in local government finance for next year at least match the Scottish Government's own budget increase, and in relation to what is announced today, it appears to fall short of that ask. And finally, Presiding Officer, this is not the time to waste government resources on the preparation of another independence referendum bill. All the government resources need to be devoted to tackling the pandemic and its economic consequences, not wasted on constitutional divisions. Presiding Officer, this budget process is a chance for the Scottish Government to put aside its party political priorities and act in the national interest. That will be the test of whether this budget delivers for Scotland. Thank you.
Kate Forbes.
Well, I thank Murdo Fraser for his kind wishes at the beginning of his statement. Now, of course, in terms of talking about wasting time, I'm standing here delivering a budget investing £1.1 billion in skills, £6 billion in capital infrastructure and £3.5 billion for social security and welfare payments. Meanwhile, of course, his leader is breaking the spirit of the rules in essential travel to do what? Make the case, apparently, for the union, because he's running scared after poll shows support for independence. But in terms of the substance, of course, I said in my statement, I said that I was grateful for the additional funding. Financially, of course, the UK Government has engineered our dependency and reliance on them by denying us reasonable borrowing powers, and it's insulting people's intelligence to suggest Scotland couldn't borrow, like every other country around the world, to intervene. But of course, if the Tories want to claim full responsibility for the economic interventions, then they also need to take responsibility for the dithering and the delays to extending furlough, the huge delay right now to extending non-domestic rates relief, and the potential to see increased unemployment in April if furlough is not extending. The last point was around the additional funding, and there is £1.3 billion that has been confirmed in the UK spending review. That is to cover health, it's to cover transport, it's to cover jobs. We know that the extension to non-domestic rates relief for a full year would cost £900 million. The UK Government is currently sitting on £21 billion of announced but undistributed COVID funding, and so if the Tories want to provide that relief extended for a full year, then they should ask their party leaders in Westminster to release that £21 billion, and as soon as I've got confirmation, I will most certainly extend non-domestic rates relief.
Jackie Bailey.
Can I too congratulate the Cabinet Secretary on her engagement on behalf of the Scottish Labour Party. It was indeed a bright spot in an otherwise gloomy outlook. We do need a budget for economic recovery, a budget for jobs. We're heading for a huge economic crisis and a cost of living crisis not seen since wartime. So I welcome the renewed focus on the economy, the extension of business rates relief, the reduction in rates poundage, and I look forward to having further discussions, because I note that the Scottish National Investment Bank's money has actually decreased, and at a time when we should be focusing on economic recovery, that is disappointing. I will also look forward to further discussion on support for local government, which falls short of what's required. But can I, Presiding Officer, turn to the question of pay? There is no doubt that health and social care workers put themselves and their health at risk during the pandemic. The Cabinet Secretary described them as heroes, and I couldn't agree with her more. In her statement, she talked about NHS staff, but I didn't see mention of social care staff. The people who work in social care are predominantly female, they're low paid, they're earning £8 to £9 an hour. They have cared for our older people and vulnerable people at this most difficult of times. Surely they deserve more than the living wage. Surely they finally deserve to be properly valued and recognised by society. And surely, presiding officer, they deserve £15 an hour as called for by the GMB. Will the Cabinet Secretary give social care workers that pay rise that they deserve? And if not now, when?
Kate Forbes.
Thank Jackie Bailey for her well wishes as well. And she said in her question quite a number of times that she welcomed elements of the statement. She also said she looked forward to further discussion. And of course, this year, like every other year over the last 4 years, I look forward to working across party lines to secure an agreement for the budget and provide that stability that I think the public expect from us. Now, she talks about public sector pay, and I was very clear after the UK Government's decision to freeze public sector pay that it misjudged the public mood and it misjudged the impact and the contributions that had been made by our public sector workers. And that's why today I have announced the 3% uplift for the lowest paid up to £25,000 and confirmed that we will put in place the living wage. Now, of course, the public sector pay policy that I have outlined covers not all public sector workers, but it does act as a reference point for the wider Scottish public sector workforce, including NHS Agenda for Change. And I was quite clear too in my comments that I look forward to working with the Cabinet Secretary for Health in looking at the Agenda for Change and the workforce deals over the coming year. Now, of course, many social care workers operate in local government, and whilst we do not have a direct relationship with local government workers, this fair pay policy recognises the contribution that they've made, but also the material impact of the UK Government's choice to freeze public sector pay on our budget.
We'll move now to the open questions, and I have a lot of them, so please bear that in mind. We'll try and get them all in. And I first of all call Willie Rennie to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Even though this budget is bigger than ever before by quite some margin, we do have a duty in this Parliament to spend every single penny wisely and to put the recovery from the pandemic first. But I don't believe the £1.1 billion for mental health will be enough, when we had asked for £1.2 billion, and that was before the pandemic hit and the massive impact that it's had on our mental health. The budget's largely silent on getting our education system back up the international rankings and the value of teachers. And business support schemes have too many holes, and it's taking too long to get the funds to business. So will the Finance Secretary look again at these priorities in the discussions that we have planned?
Kate Forbes.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that we've got discussions planned. That's fantastic. And I look forward to engaging with the Liberal Democrats in securing support for this budget. And I will be very open to suggestions and ideas, and we'll take a very transparent and open approach to those budget engagements. I had thought that Willie Rennie might welcome the increased funding for Orkney and Shetland Isles ferries. It shows what can be done when we do work across on a cross-party basis, and perhaps the Lib Dems could have been quite powerful from the beginning when it comes to delivering for their constituencies if we'd taken a similarly constructive approach in previous years. So whether it's on mental health, on education or on business support, I'm happy to work with Willie Rennie.
Patrick Harvey, please, followed by Bruce Crawford.
Once again, we're hearing commitments on a green agenda, while the motorways and trunk roads budget goes up, as it has relentlessly. There's no sign of the promised increase in the energy efficiency budget, and the main new measure on public transport is the one the Greens secured a year ago and which the Scottish Government hasn't implemented yet. The Cabinet Secretary seems proud that 37% of our capital spending is low carbon, but as long ago as the 2016-17 budget, the Government was criticised on the grounds that the figure was only 52%. The Cabinet Secretary is clearly keen to claim that her budget lays the groundwork for a green recovery. But if that's to be meaningful, it means doing less of what's harmful, not just more of what isn't. Can the Cabinet Secretary point to any substantial example of high-carbon infrastructure which will now not go ahead to free up resources for greener priorities?
Kate Forbes.
Thank Patrick Harvey for that question. A point to make, I think that Patrick Harvey had welcomed the Infrastructure Investment Commission's decision to prioritise maintenance costs on high carbon infrastructure rather than replacement, and that accounts for some of the figures that we see before us today. But I do fully and wholeheartedly believe that this is a budget that delivers that green economy. Looking at the figures, £2 billion of additional funding to decarbonise the way that we live, travel and heat, £100 million for the Green Jobs Fund, £100 million in active travel and increase in low-carbon transport. That lays the groundwork, but of course, like with other leaders in this chamber, I'm happy to work with Patrick Harvey to look at what more we can do and to look at how we can ensure that in setting the framework and the groundwork for that green recovery, we ensure that we're using our money as wisely and as carefully as possible.
Bruce Crawford, followed by Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, I'm pleased that the Scottish Government has committed to supporting 100% business rates relief for at least the first 3 months of the new financial year. However, if 100% relief is to be available again in 2021-22 for the full year, there remains a significant financial gap to be filled. I recognise the challenge the Cabinet Secretary faces in balancing the books with a cash-limited budget. Does she agree, therefore, that it is imperative that the UK Treasury commit to funding 100% relief at the earliest possible date and give business the stability and certainty it badly requires?
Kate Forbes.
Thank Bruce Crawford for the question. I know that businesses need as much advance notice as possible to make decisions for the next financial year. And that is why, whilst I've been clear that we cannot afford an extension without the UK Government doing something similar for a year, I have used every penny at my disposal to at least provide an initial 3-month extension with the reassurance that if that is extended further, I will follow suit. However, businesses cannot wait until the 3rd of March, leaving them only a matter of weeks before the end of the financial year to know about that extension and about that certainty. And therefore, whilst this decision goes as far as we can, I would strongly urge the Chancellor to give that certainty to businesses now and not to delay and not to dither, as he's done so often on extending furlough.
Maurice Golden, followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Support for businesses is welcome, but one of the problems is that funds are not reaching businesses fast enough. It is often months between the SNP announcing a scheme and payment hitting bank accounts. That is a recipe for job losses and business closures. So, will the Finance Secretary today give an assurance to honour the original pledge this SNP government made to deliver payments within 10 working days?
Kate Forbes. Well, I'd agree with Maurice Golden on the importance of money reaching businesses, which is why I'm so pleased that local government has been paying out tens of millions of pounds this week alone for the Strategic Framework Business Fund, grants of up to £3,000 every 4 weeks. And also, the top-ups are being paid this month as well, up to £25,000 for hospitality. And of course, that means a pub or a restaurant with a rateable value of over £51,000 or bigger premises. A business in Scotland will receive £16,000 more than their English equivalents. So it is important to get the money out the door quickly. It's important that we work collaboratively with local government, and that's why we've provided additional funding to local government of £12 million to help distribute grants as quickly as possible. But let's not take our eye off the ball, that grants are being paid right now.
Emma Harper, followed by Alex Rowley.
It's clear that the immediate impacts of Brexit have had a disproportionate impact on Scotland's rural economies, such as across Dumfries and Galloway in my South Scotland region. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise how this budget will ensure that no part of Scotland will be forgotten or left behind?
Kate Forbes.
Well, we do recognise the acute impact that's been seen by our rural communities, whether they're in Emma Harper's constituency or in the Highlands and the Islands. I mentioned the doubling of the Rural Tourism Infrastructure Fund, which is something that I'm particularly proud of, having seen the benefit it's delivered in rural communities. But across the rural economy, we have increased funding for forestry, for the enterprise agencies, for tourism, for food and drink, and we've ensured that there's additional COVID funding to help support businesses in those areas, responding particularly to some of the Tourism Task Force's recommendations. Of course, there is one challenge because of the replacement to EU funding has fallen short from the UK Government, and we continue to press the UK Government for more clarity on future funding for our farming and our fishing communities.
Alex Rowley, followed by George Adam.
Presiding Officer, I do not doubt the enormity, the challenge that government faces at this stage. So I would like to congratulate Kate Forbes in bringing forward the budget today. I hope she will take serious the offer for Jackie Baillie. There's no doubt that the most undervalued workforce in Scotland is the social care sector, and I do hope that you will discuss with the Labour Party our proposal for £15 per hour for all social care workers. But could I specifically ask, on youth unemployment, today you talk about £230.9 million to skills development to work with partners on this area. There are currently 36,000 young people who are unemployed. Is there a guarantee for that 36,000 people that they will get some kind of meaningful employment?
Kate Forbes.
I thank Alex Rowley and do make that commitment to work across party lines. In terms of providing support specifically to young people, that is at the heart of our skills agenda. Now, I talked about the Young Persons Guarantee. There's also the National Transition Training Fund. But our approach is to ensure that over the next 2 years, every young person under the age of 24, leaving none behind, every young person under the age of 24 has a job or an apprenticeship or an education and training opportunity. And I'd be very happy to go through the detail with him, or I see my colleague Fiona Hislop here go through the detail in terms of how we are ensuring that no young people are left behind.
George Adam, followed by Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Many businesses in my constituency of Paisley have had a difficult year. They've appreciated the funding and support they've received to date, but in the context of significant ongoing spending and business support, much of which is demand-led, it appeals to me that managing the expenditure within the consequentials provided by the UK Government just doesn't seem sustainable. Does the Cabinet Secretary believe that the current fiscal levers available to the Scottish Government are sufficient to ensure that the Scottish Government can meet demand going forward?
Kate Forbes.
Well, I think that point around the fiscal framework has actually been recognised now right across the chamber. It's been recognised by cross-party finance committee, it's been recognised by independent stakeholders that the fiscal framework was already proving insufficient before COVID, and the UK Government's denial of any temporary fiscal flexibility to manage the volatility under the pandemic has compounded our financial challenge. Now, there is an opportunity to review the fiscal framework, and today I announced obviously the fact that we do have some additional flexibilities next year which will be welcome, but they are temporary and they don't go far enough. So it is important for the sake of businesses and our other public services that we are able to manage the spending that we have available and manage it in a flexible way.
Donald Cameron and then Annabel Ewing.
The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that UK Government support for the NHS during the pandemic has gone beyond the 5-year forward view, with spending on the NHS in England due to increase by £6.3 billion next year. Can she confirm that the Scottish Government will pass on every penny of the Barnett consequentials arising from this funding to the NHS in Scotland?
Kate Forbes.
The very short answer to that very important question is yes. The Scottish Budget takes total health portfolio funding in excess of £16 billion. That's an increase of over £800 million, and over and above that, there is £869 million of funding to address pressures specifically related to COVID-19, like vaccinations and Test and Protect.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware how important council leisure centres are for local communities, and this is indeed the case in my constituency of Cowdenbeath. Can the Cabinet Secretary therefore outline how this Scottish Government budget will support Fife Council and indeed other local authorities to make up any funding gaps to ensure that these key community resources can continue to play their vital role in the months ahead?
Kate Forbes.
Well, it's an important question because we know that for local government, not only has there been an increase in demand putting pressure on their services, but also sources of income have been depleted as a result of lockdown measures. And that's why it was so essential that I announced today an increase in the lost income scheme from £90 million to £200 million for the very purpose that Annabel Ewing has outlined. And that adds to the previously committed £49 million of consequentials to support lost income, for example, for councils' ALIOs. So the overall local government settlement reflects the needs to support day-to-day services, but also the additional COVID costs.
Sarah Boyack, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Cabinet Secretary, the Accounts Commission identified a £767 million council funding gap as a result of the pandemic, and today's budget announcement commits you to allocate £369 million additional funding. So do you accept there's still a gap of £400 million? Will you use this year's Scottish Government underspend to ensure our councils don't start the year with even worse cuts to services than last year? And did you just announce a 3% increase in pay for public sector workers? How will local authorities be able to afford that uplift, given the impact of COVID, huge pressures in core funding last year, and years of cuts to the non-core services, which will be vital for rebuilding our local economies?
Kate Forbes.
Well, can I just put one thing straight, that there is no underspend this year, having just allocated every penny of funding that we are looking to deploy just now. In terms of local government, the funding package that I have outlined just now includes additional funding for local government's core revenue and core services, as well as additional funding to replace lost income, as well as additional funding for COVID-related pressures. But again, when it comes to looking at whether it's local government or any other line, if the Labour Party want to provide sensible and wise and intelligent proposals for what we can do to continue to support our public services, bearing in mind that we need to manage that within the funding envelope that we have, then I'm very happy to have those conversations with Sarah Boyack.
Kenneth Gibson and then Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Broadcasting, Entertainment, Communications and Theatre Union at Committee this morning presented figures showing that after the financial crash, the arts sector led the country out of recession in terms of growth. Will the Cabinet Secretary look at providing additional support for the sector in order to help it survive, aiding their economic recovery and boosting well-being as we emerge from the pandemic?
Kate Forbes.
Yeah, like many other sectors, it has been a sector that's been hard hit. We've already put in place some immediate survival funding for parts of the sector, and we'll look to continue to respond to their needs to ensure that we have a thriving sector and they play a key role in our recovery from COVID.
Liz Smith, followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you. When the Cabinet Secretary attended the Environment Committee on the 6th of October, she put on the record unequivocally that the creation of green jobs was a major Scottish priority. And she said that the same was true a year ago, and obviously she's outlined some major green policy spends this afternoon. But the facts tell us, Cabinet Secretary, that the Scottish Government is way behind in terms of delivering the 28,000 green jobs that Alex Salmond promised would have been delivered by 2020. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, when will this budget deliver these very much needed jobs?
Kate Forbes.
Are looking to two things. The first is the fact that unemployment is set to rise after the furlough scheme ends, and secondly, we have an opportunity to invest in green recovery and ensure that we are meeting our climate change targets. And in terms of this budget not only provides the £100 million that I mentioned to support green jobs, as well as the Green Workforce Academy to help with retraining, reskilling, and to ensure that whether it's investing in biodiversity, whether it's investing in research and development, whether it's supporting our public bodies that are at the forefront of that, we are creating those new green jobs, as well as ensuring that we've got the pipeline of talent, training up young people in particular to have the skills that we need to meet our climate change ambitions.
Rona Mackay, followed by James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise how this budget will help to close the attainment gap?
Kate Forbes.
Well, that mission to close the attainment gap remains central to our plans, and perhaps the pandemic has only exacerbated the need to provide support to the most vulnerable people in our communities. The Scottish Government published an equity audit on the 13th of January 2021, which deepens our understanding of the impact of COVID-19 on children from disadvantaged backgrounds and sets clear areas of focus for accelerating recovery. And those findings provide clear indicators for supporting children and young people in the next phase, particularly of remote learning and planning the return to school. So we're continuing to invest in the Scottish Attainment Challenge in 2021-22, and that includes over £127 million in pupil equity funding to help close that attainment gap.
James Kelly, followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you. Citizens Advice Scotland have recently highlighted rising levels of council tax debt, with recent cases that they have dealt with amounting to debt levels of £3,000 per case. This causes great levels of anxiety and stress for those who are struggling to pay these bills. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what action the Government is going to take in the budget to specifically address the issue of those who are struggling with rising levels of debt and are unable to pay council tax bills?
Kate Forbes.
It's something that we've been mindful of from the very beginning of the pandemic, and in fact I think one of the first funding decisions that was made last March was to provide additional funding for the council tax reduction scheme to ensure that was extended, and that commitment to continue to support communities carries us through into the next financial year. So we will continue to ensure that council tax reduction means that council tax is more progressive than it would otherwise be, but I've also obviously outlined today a freeze on council tax in terms of compensating councils that choose to freeze council tax to try and help the very households that James Kelly has identified.
Mark MacDonald, followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The reduction in poundage announced by the Cabinet Secretary is welcome, but she'll be aware that there are calls in the North East for her to do more to offset the impact of the 2017 revaluation on businesses in Aberdeen. 23% of businesses in Aberdeen are eligible for small business bonus, which is the lowest proportion in all of Scotland. And she knows that I've asked her previously about flexibility around nationally applied rateable value cut-offs for business support. Will she meet with me to discuss these issues and look at the possibility of a deal for the North East of Scotland that will help to deliver for businesses who are hard-pressed at the moment in Scotland's economic engine?
Kate Forbes.
Again, the short answer is I'd be happy to meet with Mark MacDonald. One of the decisions that's been taken is to extend the transition relief that was provided to Aberdeen businesses because the revaluation has been delayed further. And in terms of some of the reliefs that we have expanded on, they will hopefully be very helpful to Aberdeenshire businesses, particularly extending the Business Growth Accelerator as well as the Fresh Start scheme to encourage the occupation of previously empty properties.
Willie Coffey, followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The requirement for our businesses to close to limit the spread of COVID has had a substantial impact on our town centres, not least in my own in Kilmarnock and Irvine Valley. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide any further details on the funding allocated to our town centres and business improvement districts to get back on their feet? And will she also consider what more can be done to help our town centres in the longer term?
Kate Forbes.
Well, our town centres have been hard hit, and there was already structural challenges before the pandemic, and that's only been exacerbated. So the budget provides £55 million in support of community regeneration, town centres and 20-minute neighbourhoods, as well as our ongoing support for Clyde Gateway as the initial investment backing delivery of our place-based investment programme. And that builds on the £22 million economic stimulus and other funding provided for town centres, smaller settlements and the business improvements district support last year.
Jamie Green, followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you. Our vital higher education sector made a very clear and specific ask of the Government of £200 million to fully fund the Government's own policies. They've been given 18 in the budget. This Parliament also voted by majority for at least 2,000 more teachers in our schools and the rollout of free school meals for all primary children starting in the next financial year. Can I ask you, Finance Secretary, why none of these asks, including the ones this chamber voted for, have been honoured in today's budget?
Kate Forbes.
Well, that might be a good question if it was true, but it's not. So £45 million has gone into this budget in order to extend the number of teachers. And separately to that, on the first part of his question, we have provided over £1.1 billion to universities in support of their continued financial sustainability and increased funding to £0.7 billion in our colleges to ensure that they can continue to produce a highly skilled population, both of which are key to our economic recovery.
Christine Graham, followed by Ian Gray.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for a statement. I welcome the £259 million additional non-recurring COVID funding to local authorities. With 2 local authorities in my constituency, Midlothian and Borders, will that allocation, when they get it, be ring-fenced, or will there be flexibility for councils to reflect their differences?
Kate Forbes.
There will be flexibilities. So having announced 3 parts to the local government settlement of increased lost income scheme to fund lost funding, as well as funding for the core settlement, and then additional funding to replace pressures on COVID-related pressures, that is flexible, and local government can deploy it as they see fit in terms of their funding pressures.
Ian Gray, followed by John Mason.
Thank you. I heard what the Cabinet Secretary said about the importance of our universities and colleges, how critical they are to economic recovery and recovery from the pandemic. But the fact of the matter is that today's budget leaves them hundreds of millions of pounds short of what they tell us they need just to be sustainable. Does the Cabinet Secretary understand that this is not investing in our world-class institutions? It is rather cutting the feet from under them.
Kate Forbes.
We do recognise the point that Ian Gray has mentioned in terms of the challenges, the sustainability challenges, and of course that's why we announced £75 million last year to help them with that. And in terms of the settlement includes resources to support our universities, including increasing the higher education capital funding to further support their research and knowledge exchange with other universities, as well as ensuring that college resource allocations have been boosted as well to ensure the sustainability of the sector. That will also include funding towards student support. So there's no question that our higher and our further education sectors, like many other parts of the public sector, are under pressure, and this budget goes as far as we can to provide support.
John Mason, followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you. It's clear that finances are going to be tight in the coming years, and I take the point that the Cabinet Secretary is not wanting to change taxation at the moment, because some people are really struggling financially. But other people and some organisations are doing quite well financially. Can she expand on her thinking about taxation going forward?
Kate Forbes.
Well, my view is that we should be delaying any fiscal consolidation or tax rises until economic recovery is well underway. That was outlined in a document that we published, the UK Fiscal Path, published last June and then updated again in November. People and businesses need certainty, stability. The income tax policy proposals I've put forward today delivers that, as does non-domestic rates and council tax as well. So it's a fair and progressive tax system to begin with, but we're trying to deliver that sustainability into the long term, so that when we're delivering economic recovery, we can revisit our tax policies to ensure that they're aligned with the economic growth at the time.
Rachel Hamilton and then Stuart McMillan.
The Scottish Government have dithered and delayed getting guidance and funds to local authorities, and this has prevented businesses receiving financial support. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell me when the extra cash allocated in this budget for discretionary funding will be in the hands of councils with the relevant guidance and criteria so that cash-strapped businesses can pay their bills?
Kate Forbes.
Well, the doubling of the discretionary fund relates to funding that the local government has already. They've got the guidance. In fact, there's only 2 important elements of guidance for the discretionary fund, because it's entirely up to local authorities how they distribute it. And that is that it goes to businesses, and it goes to businesses that have been hardest hit and haven't had the funding to date. So we've outlined what the pipeline is of business support schemes, but now it's up to local authorities to use it and align it with local need.
Stuart McMillan, followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Finance Secretary provide an assurance that this budget will actually help families living in poverty, particularly in constituencies like my own, Greenock and Inverclyde?
Kate Forbes.
Well, it's a key priority for the Government, and it underpins our wider ambitions for a fairer and more prosperous Scotland. As outlined in the most recent Child Poverty Progress Report, investment targeted to support households on low incomes reached almost £2 billion in 2019-2020, with £672 million targeted specifically to support children in low-income households. And the budget for this year goes even further and includes £68 million towards the game-changing Scottish Child Payment, which will benefit families in Stuart McMillan's constituency.
Pauline McNeill, followed by Fulton McGregor.
The voluntary sector has embedded in our communities, providing a lifeline for families, providing food and delivering this on a shoestring budget with so many funding streams. The Cabinet Secretary didn't mention the voluntary or third sector. I can see from the figures that the increase is under £2 million. SCVO recently stated that 20% of charities reported a critical threat to their financial viability in the next 12 months. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline how she sees the importance of the voluntary and third sector in this pandemic? And does she recognise the work that they've done so far? And can she clarify whether or not they'll be committed to further funding these services, given the important role that they played in the last 9 to 10 months?
Kate Forbes.
I can reassure Pauline McNeill in saying that I do fully recognise the work of the voluntary and third sector when it comes to responding to the pandemic. And of course, that's why some of the first funds we invested was to provide support to them. And significant funds have been invested from the Communities Package in spring and the Winter Package as well. Now, of course, you'll have seen the publication of the recommendations of the Social Renewal Advisory Board recommendations. That is that underlines the importance of the third sector, and we will continue to provide investment to them. I would suggest that when it comes to the beginning of the next financial year and the potential for additional COVID funding, that we will be sure to provide additional funding where it's needed the most, including to the third sector.
Fulton McGregor and then Graeme Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, nightclubs and soft plays are quite unique in that they have remained shut throughout the pandemic. And if we are being realistic, they are the type of businesses that are likely to remain so for some considerable time to come. I know from nightclub and soft play owners in my constituency of Coatbridge and Christen that the specific grants paid in November last year were very welcome indeed. Can I ask if the draft budget has factored for the possibility of a similar type of payment at some point in the future, should it transpire, as is expected, that these particular types of businesses, because of their very nature of course, will remain closed for an extended period of time on essential public health grounds?
Kate Forbes.
Well, of course, as I said in my statement, the Strategic Framework Business Fund will continue to pay funding to businesses that are required to close or to modify their operations by law. I know that nightclub and soft play owners did benefit from the grants paid in November. We keep all the grants under review, recognising that there is a limited pot of funding and we need to ensure that it goes to the hardest hit businesses, which is why we have these sectoral funds to try and fill in the gap. So yes, we will keep that under review.
Graeme Simpson, followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you. It's been good to see more people walking, cycling during the pandemic, but if we're to maintain that progress, we need to invest more. So can the Finance Secretary explain why she's cut the budget for sustainable and active travel?
On the contrary, we will invest £118 million through the Future Transport Fund in low carbon and other transformational initiatives, and we'll continue to invest £100.5 million in active travel, enabling the delivery of high quality walking, wheeling and cycling initiatives, access to bikes and supporting people who choose to be active and choose to use sustainable travel. So that funding is there and will continue to ensure that people have access to low carbon transport options.
Bob Doris and then Miles Briggs.
Presiding Officer, I was pleased to hear the Finance Secretary outline support to tackle poverty. But as we rebuild our economy, we must also tackle inequalities and provide equal opportunities for all. Will the Finance Secretary expand on how the measures set out in this budget can achieve that ambition?
Kate Forbes.
This is a budget that has tackling inequalities and tackling poverty at its very core, and it includes, for example, a significant increase in delivering our game-changing Scottish Child Payment, which will provide support to thousands of families who need it. We have seen over the last 2 years substantial investment in tackling inequalities. That need has only been exacerbated during the pandemic, and we will ensure that the funding, whether it's for the Scottish Child Payment, or it's to try and tackle the digital divide, or it's to provide the commitment to tackle child poverty, is delivered on in this coming financial year.
Miles Briggs, followed by Colin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Many people watching this statement today will be incredibly worried about their jobs, Finance Secretary. So can I ask you specifically, why has the Government not taken forward the Conservatives' ask to establish job security councils, so that as we look towards coming out of the pandemic, we can make sure that people who are unemployed can be rapidly matched with new opportunities? And given that each and every one of us will have very diverse local economies across our regions and constituencies, will she look at this again before she comes back to Parliament?
With respect, whilst I'm very open to any proposals, and of course I will reiterate my suggestion that we work across cross-party lines to get the budget through, whilst I'm open to any proposals, I don't think it's security councils or any other kind of councils that the business community need right now. What they need is investment, targeted investment in terms of employability and skills. We see that with the Young Person's Guarantee, investment directly in businesses. We see that with the survival grants and investment through the Scottish National Investment Bank. And we see the increase in capitalisation in this coming year. But of course, with good proposals, I am more than happy to take those into account and work across party lines.
Colin Beattie, please, followed by Neil Findlay.
Cabinet Secretary, what resources are being committed to help exports get back on track following the double hit of the COVID-19 pandemic and Brexit, both of which have badly damaged Scottish businesses?
Kate Forbes.
Well, it does include funding for our strategy to increase exports. We obviously have a clear and a robust strategy as a trading nation. That strategy is more important than ever before, and that strategy wants to see Scotland's exports grow to 25% of GDP by 2029. So this year we're investing over £7 million to help deliver the ambition, as well as an additional £5 million to deliver year 2 of the food and drink sector recovery plans. So whilst the implications of the UK Government's hard Brexit makes our job more difficult, it also makes this work even more important, and there's funding there and a clear strategy.
Neil Findlay, followed by John Scott.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary said that there would be additional money for mental health. I have a parliamentary answer here that tells me in the whole of Scotland that there's only 46 child and adolescent mental health beds in the whole country. That is an astonishingly low number. What can families take from the Cabinet Secretary's statement that will ensure that we have the proper care and treatment for young people going through a mental health problem, because we know that there will now, after COVID, be an even greater crisis?
It's a really important question for those very reasons, and whilst I can outline the increase in funding which I already have in terms of overall spending in mental health to over £1.1 billion, money is only half the challenge. The other challenge is ensuring that there is a reform to provide the services and the facilities where people need it. And I will continue to work with the Cabinet, the Minister for Mental Health, in ensuring that the funding is in place to match the policy ambitions to ensure that there is access to mental health, particularly coming out of the pandemic, which has taken a huge toll on people's mental health.
John Scott, followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And declaring an interest as a farmer, and given that there is much transitional funding required to take Scotland rural areas towards net zero, is the Cabinet Secretary confident that sufficient funds are being made available in this budget to achieve early carbon reduction targets as recently agreed by Parliament?
Kate Forbes.
There is a continued investment, for example, in the Agricultural Transformation Programme, which provides £40 million to take action to help deliver our target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045 and improve environmental sustainability. So, yes, there is funding in the budget, £630 million in ongoing agricultural support, but there is also funding to help farmers with that transition.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, is the money from the Recover, Renew, Transform programme budget separate to the funding arrangements for the various justice organisations it mentions? Or is this money included in the justice organisations' budgets as outlined in the budget figures published today?
Kate Forbes.
Well, the budget figures announced today includes the overall funding that is available to either portfolios or to those specific budget lines. And so that sets the overall spending envelope within which organisations, public sector bodies operate. Where if there is additional funding available, for example, after the UK Government's budget, then we will look to deploy that funding as easily and as quickly as possible to meet the needs where they are.
That concludes questions on the Cabinet Secretary's statement, and we shall shortly move on to the next item of business. Nobody. Looks like I'll have to suspend business for a few minutes. So this meeting is suspended. The session is suspended, Mr. Finlay. Mr. Finlay, I will remain in the chair so that you can raise your point of order when we resume. This session of Parliament will now resume and the meeting resumes. Point of order, Neil Finlay.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I can fully understand why you suspended Parliament there, but this does set a precedent. I think everyone knows that debates, question time and all the rest of it is a follow-on. We're going to be discussing a very important piece of legislation that I think will be agreed consensually by the Parliament, and I would never seek to halt that. However, I have to question whether the same tolerance would be applied if, say, a member, an opposition member or whoever didn't turn up for a question, didn't turn up for their member's bill or a motion or a member's debate. So I really want to question whether this is going to be a consistent approach that the chair, and I'm not having a go at you personally, I understand why this is done. Whoever is in the chair is going to take, should members be elsewhere for whatever reason. Thanks.
Thank you for your point of order, Mr Finlay. And of course, can I say to the Chamber that the reason that I felt I had to suspend was because business couldn't carry on as it should have, because we had no one here who could move the motion that we are debating this afternoon. But can I say that this is not acceptable and should not have happened, and the business should indeed have followed on from the Cabinet Secretary's statement on the budget. Yes, point of order, Mr Finlay.
Follow up, just so that I'm clear in my own mind on that then. In normal circumstances, would that have meant that that business would have fell and we would have moved on to the next business? Is that how the standard? I personally don't know that, so it was just for my own information. Thanks.
There is a decision that can be taken by the presiding officer, Mr Finlay. The motion as put forward is of course proposed by Humza Yousaf and seconded by Ash Denham, neither of whom were in the room, either in this chamber or on the Blue Jeans platform. Therefore, the motion could not be moved. Therefore, I took the decision not to abandon the business, as you say, but to suspend this meeting so that we could carry on with this very important business. So we shall now carry on with that very important business, and it is a debate on motion 23983 in the name of Humza Yousaf on the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill at stage 1. And I would invite those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Humza Yousaf to speak to and move the motion for up to 12 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I begin by apologising to you, Presiding Officer, and to the entire Chamber. I was getting ready to log on before the end of Ms Forbes' statement and can only by a technical malfunction. I had been on the phone to our IT earlier on in the day to resolve the issue. I thought it was resolved, but clearly not. So forgive me, and I apologise to the Presiding Officer, of course, and also to all members in the Chamber and present. I am pleased to open this afternoon's Stage 1 debate on the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill. This bill is an important additional piece of the Scottish Government's overall approach in improving how Scotland deals with the scourge of domestic abuse. Much progress has been made in recent years through, for example, the new offence of domestic abuse and increased support for those experiencing domestic abuse, all delivered through the prism of the equally safe strategy. But there's always more to do, and this bill is part of those necessary further steps. Presiding Officer, I intend to respond to a number of issues raised during the scrutiny process in my speech. But first, let me thank members of the Justice Committee, the clerking team, and all those who gave evidence on the bill that helped shape the comprehensive, very helpful Stage 1 report produced very swiftly following completion of the oral evidence sessions. Before I address the specific points raised in the report, I think it is important I briefly set out what the bill actually does. So Part 1 of the bill creates a new scheme of domestic abuse protection notices and also domestic abuse protection orders. The notices and orders will be used to protect people at risk from abusive behaviour by a partner or ex-partner where there is an immediate risk of abuse. The bill empowers senior police officers to be able to make a very short-term domestic abuse protection notice, which can remove a suspected perpetrator of domestic abuse from the home of the person at risk. It can also prohibit them from approaching or contacting the person at risk, as well as a limited number of other very specific conditions. These notices can be made prior to consideration by a court, and they're intended to allow for protection to be put in place immediately where police consider it to be necessary. The bill also contains a power for a court to make a domestic abuse protection order, which can have effect for up to 2 months initially and is capable of being extended for up to 3 months in total. The system of orders is designed to allow for judicial oversight very quickly following the imposition of a domestic abuse protection notice, as the police are required to apply to the court for an order within 1 court day of making a notice, and the court are required to hold a meeting in relation to the application by the following court day. This is an important procedural safeguard for protecting the rights of any person who is subject to a police notice. The police can also apply for an order without first making a notice in a case where they consider an order is required to protect the person at risk from harm, but that the level of urgency is not such by making a notice. These measures are intended to complement existing criminal or civil processes by providing a new means of protecting a person of risk. That is immediate, that does not require action on the part of the person at risk, and of course, crucially, is independent of any criminal investigation where there may not be a sufficiency of evidence to proceed with a criminal prosecution and unlock existing criminal court powers, such as special conditions or bail, or special conditions of bail, or indeed of remand. Presiding Officer, Part 2 of the bill makes provisions to enable social landlords to transfer their tenancy to a victim of domestic abuse. It does this by creating a new ground on which a social landlord can apply for a court order to end the tenancy of a perpetrator. This is with a view of transferring it to the victim of domestic abuse, or where the perpetrator and victim are joint tenants, end the perpetrator's interest in the tenancy. And this would allow the victim to remain in the family home as a sole tenant. Having the legal ability to end the perpetrator's tenancy in domestic abuse cases will allow social landlords, without requiring victim to commence this process themselves, they will be able to take a more proactive role in supporting and protecting victims of domestic abuse and support the victim to remain permanently in the family home. I suspect I am not the only MSP presiding officer to have seen a number of cases, unfortunately, where the victim of domestic abuse felt like their only option was to flee the family home and become homeless. That cannot be right, and this bill seeks to redress that issue. Presiding Officer, it is important to reflect on the core issues that the measures in this bill are seeking to address. At the moment, a person wishing to obtain protection from domestic abuse, particularly in relation to keeping a perpetrator away from the home, can only do so if the perpetrator enters the criminal justice system or if the victim themselves takes out a civil order against the perpetrator. The onus is currently on the victim in that case. We know that when a victim of domestic abuse is living with a perpetrator, it may be very difficult for them to take steps to address their long-term safety, particularly when this involves taking action in the civil courts to remove them from their home. Some of those who have given evidence to the committee noted this can result in a victim of abuse having no alternative, as I've already said, to make themselves homeless to escape that abusive partner. The new scheme of protective notices and orders are therefore intended to fill a gap in that where someone is experiencing domestic abuse, they are more likely to lack the freedom of action to pursue a civil court process to remove a suspected perpetrator from a shared home. The measure will also provide the person at risk with short-term breathing space, which will enable them to consider what longer-term steps they may want to take to address their safety and the safety of their family, as well as their future housing options. The longer-term steps will depend on their particular circumstances, but could include pursuing other existing civil measures, such as an application to a civil court for an interdict or indeed for an exclusion order. Enabling social landlords to end a perpetrator's tenancy in domestic abuse cases also seeks to address the very real issue of why victims and their families, rather than the perpetrator, should have to leave their homes, their belongings, their community, all to seek some safety and sanctuary, while the perpetrator remains undisturbed in the family home. Presiding Officer, I welcome the committee's support for the general principles of the bill. However, I also acknowledge that a range of issues have been raised and aired during the committee's scrutiny, which are important to the eventual successful implementation of legislation. I heard from every single member of the Justice Committee, representing all different political parties, confirming the issue, of which I have no doubt, of course, that they all support greater protection for domestic abuse victims. But there was real concern about some of the operational impact of domestic abuse protection notices and orders and the interoperability of them with other civil remedies. So I hope to be able to address some of those key areas in the rest of my opening remarks. So there is most definitely a need, I think, for full and effective scrutiny of these operational matters. And I've discussed these matters, these issues that have been raised directly by the Justice Committee with me, with the Chief Constable of Police Scotland. I know the committee has also heard feedback, of course, from Police Scotland directly about some of those implementation challenges. I will instruct an implementation board led by the Scottish Government, which will bring together all the key agencies affected by the new legislation, including, of course, Police Scotland. While some of the operational issues raised during scrutiny will, of course, be for the implementation board to consider as guidance is prepared for the use of the legislation, there are also some policy matters that need to be addressed and discussed. The committee report discussed the threshold of the test before a notice or an order can be imposed. In discussions with Police Scotland, I can advise we are looking at whether the test of future harm required before a notice can be imposed should be set at significant harm, and we will keep Parliament updated as this consideration continues. Parliament will not be surprised that in my discussions with Scottish Women's Aid and other victims' organisations, they have real concern about increasing that evidential threshold. But I will continue those discussions both with Police Scotland and victim support organisations. Given the seriousness of removing a perpetrator from a home, it may be that the threshold should appropriately be set at a higher level. I'm pleased the committee supported the length of time that a notice can run and the length of time an order can run. There is a careful, I think, balancing act with these timescales to keep them as short-term protections while respecting the rights of the person who is subject to the notice of an order, bearing in mind that they have not been convicted of a crime. I consider the bill strikes that appropriate balance. The committee report also discusses the way in which views of children can help shape decision-making as to whether notices or orders should be imposed. There is a considerable challenge in balancing the fundamental policy intention of the bill to improve immediate protection for those at risk of domestic abuse while ensuring the views of affected children are taken into account. The bill does provide that the welfare of children is a key factor for the court when deciding whether to impose an order if those children would be affected by such an order. And where the court is considering imposing an order with provisions that would relate directly to a child, then the bill emphasises that any views of that child of which the sheriff is aware should be taken into account. I can confirm we will consider carefully whether further provision is needed, which continues to ensure that the overarching policy intention of immediate protection for those at risk of domestic abuse can be delivered. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, I look forward to today's debate. I commit to considering all suggestions for how best the legislation itself can be improved, and importantly, how effective operationalisation of the new system of orders and notices can be delivered. If we can deliver on both these aims, that we can ensure there is new and improved protection available for those at risk of domestic abuse. Presiding Officer, I commend the general principles of the bill to the Parliament, and I move the motion by name.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Before I call Adam Tompkins, can I say, as most of the members speaking are remote, therefore there's no opportunity for interventions. If members contributing want slightly longer for their speech, a minute or more, don't mean to be obliged, then feel free to do so, as we have time in hand. I now call Adam Tompkins on behalf of the committee. Convener, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. This is a simple bill that raises quite complex problems, problems which the Justice Committee has not found easy. As we've just heard from the Cabinet Secretary, the bill does three things, each designed to sharpen the effectiveness of the tools we have to combat domestic abuse. And combat it we must. Every year, Police Scotland are called out to something in the region of 60,000 incidents of domestic abuse. That's 5,000 every month, nearly 1,200 every week. And each one of these consumes on average 9 hours of police time. The social costs are massive, to say nothing of the horrific impact on the victims of crime. Let me say a word about these three new tools that the bill provides for. The first is the Domestic Abuse Protection Notice, or DAPN. A Domestic Abuse Protection Notice enables the police to impose requirements on a person where the police have reasonable grounds to believe that the person is engaged in abusive behaviour. And such a notice is said to be an emergency measure. A breach of its conditions is a criminal offence, and its effects can be severe, forcing a person to leave their home and, if necessary, preventing them from approaching or contacting their family. The second tool, the Domestic Abuse Protection Order, or DAPO, is imposed not by the police but by a court of law. And wherever a DAPN is issued, the police must apply to the court for a Domestic Abuse Protection Order on the very first court day after the notice is issued, and the hearing must be held and concluded in court on that day. A DAPO may impose any condition on a person that may be imposed by a DAPN, but unlike the notice, the order may remain in force for up to 2 months, extendable to 3 months on a further application to the court. And breach of any condition imposed by a DAPO is a criminal offence. And again, it needs to be understood, Presiding Officer, that the effects of a DAPO on a person may be severe, excluding the person from their home and depriving them of contact with their family. The third tool relates to housing. The bill gives to social landlords a new power to evict a tenant where the tenant has engaged in abusive behaviour. And this new power will sit alongside other powers already contained in Scots law in, for example, the Matrimonial Homes Family Protection Act and the Housing Scotland Act. Presiding Officer, the Justice Committee took evidence on the Domestic Abuse Protection Bill in December and this month in January. As well as hearing from the Bill team and the Cabinet Secretary, we heard from stakeholders such as Scottish Women's Aid and the Scottish Women's Rights Centre, from the Law Society and from academics, from Police Scotland, and from housing experts such as the Chartered Institute of Housing and Homeless Action Scotland, as well as others. And I would like to thank all of the witnesses who helped the committee with our inquiry. And again, I thank our tireless clerks and Spice for all their work in supporting the committee through what was a very fast-paced inquiry. I also thank the government for its response to our Stage 1 report, which was received earlier this week. Presiding Officer, our report focuses really on two concerns. The first is whether the new powers contained in the bill are necessary and how they will fit alongside the plethora of other powers which the criminal justice system already has to deal with family disputes and domestic abuse. And the second is whether the new powers are compatible with Scotland's human rights obligations. Let me say straight away that the committee had no hesitation in supporting the policy intentions underpinning this bill. The committee supports the underlying policy intentions wholeheartedly and unanimously. But good intentions, whilst they are a necessary ingredient of good law, do not of themselves guarantee that the law we make is fit for purpose. And the committee has been anxious to ensure the powers conferred by the bill are capable of being operated and implemented effectively. The committee's anxieties in this regard were amplified, I think, when we took evidence from Police Scotland. Detective Chief Superintendent Samantha McCluskey told us that she had a variety of doubts and puzzles about how the new powers contained in the bill, and in particular the power to issue a domestic abuse protection notice, are to work in practice. What is the evidential threshold which must be crossed before a notice is imposed? What should the police do in the event that there is not only an accusation of domestic abuse, but also a counter-accusation? This situation, she said, is very challenging for officers on the ground. How should the conditions imposed under a DAPN sit in relation to other court-imposed orders or restrictions, such as bail conditions? Could a failure to issue a DAPN open the police to potential liability in the event that subsequent abuse occurs? Whereas the police have become used to working in a multi-agency way in partnership with other bodies such as social workers, in cases of domestic abuse, it is not obvious how issuing a DAPN on a person can be undertaken other than by the police alone. In all of these operational respects, DCS McCluskey told us, clarity is needed. We need to build, she said, we need to build a bit of confidence among police officers who will be expected to make decisions and build the public's confidence in our response, end quote. So the committee drew attention to these operational challenges in our conclusions and recommendations. And the Cabinet Secretary devotes several paragraphs of his response to our report, detailing how the government, in consultation with Police Scotland, intends to ensure that these challenges are met and overcome. The government accepts, I think, and I think we've just heard this from Mr. Yousaf, that some of this is going to be challenging in practice and is going to require careful implementation. And I welcome both the tone and the content of what the Cabinet Secretary has had to say about this. I want to close, Presiding Officer, by saying something about convention rights. It's clear that the powers to issue a DAPN and to make a DAPO interfere directly with human rights, most obviously the right to private and family life in Article 8 of the European Convention. Like most rights in the Convention, this is of course not an absolute right, but interferences with it need to meet two key tests. They must be necessary in the public interest, and they must be proportionate. I share the Cabinet Secretary's view that, as drafted, the bill is likely to meet both those tests. But a key component of that judgment rests on the fact that both a DAPN and a DAPO are short-term measures. The longer either is permitted to endure in any particular case, the greater the risk that a court will find a violation of convention rights. Presiding Officer, it will be seen, I think, even from this brief overview, that there is a lot in this bill. Ideally, one would have wanted to be able to scrutinise it at a less frenetic pace, but we are where we are. And the committee, whilst drawing attention to the range of issues and concerns I've outlined in my remarks this afternoon, was content to recommend, again unanimously, that the general principles of the bill be approved by the Parliament at decision time this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr Tompkins. I now call Liam Kerr to open for the Conservatives. Mr Kerr, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I confirm that the Scottish Conservatives will vote in favour of the principles of the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill at decision time tonight. We share the Chamber's condemnation of domestic abuse as a scourge on our society and welcome any attempt to address it and get victims justice. The rationale underlying this bill, I think, was set out, I thought, succinctly and well by the Cabinet Secretary in his remarks earlier. But it's particularly important to consider at the moment because we know from published data that domestic abuse has risen in Scotland over the last 3 years, and actually the number of domestic abuse charges are at a 4-year high in 2019-20. Now, the bill has at its core 3 basic aims. Firstly, to protect a person at risk of domestic abuse in the immediate term by the giving of a power to a senior police officer to issue a domestic abuse protection notice, a DAPN, on a suspected perpetrator of abuse. It then sets out the further legal steps that might be taken to ensure the longer-term safety of a person at risk, specifically giving the civil courts a power on application by the police to grant a domestic abuse protection order, a DAPO, for up to 3 months in relation to the perpetrator. And finally, there are protections around housing, which I'm pleased to see, as I recall when we were dealing with what became the Domestic Abuse Act in 2018, proposing an amendment to that bill which called for a review of measures that would have, amongst other things, excluded someone from a person's house if they presented an immediate danger to the other person or a child. Now, as the convener has just made clear, the Justice Committee considered this bill in a very tight timescale, and I'm very grateful to the clerks, to the witnesses, and indeed to my colleagues for the way this has been approached. That shortened time frame is important to keep in mind because I think all members take the view that whilst this is a really important piece of legislation with excellent aims, it is far from the finished product in terms of precision in drafting and practicality. Indeed, the committee was unequivocal that serious practical concerns over the bill needed to be addressed prior to Stage 3 approval. And it took this position because both legal bodies and the police in particular signalled outstanding issues with the drafting of the bill, which could mean its powers perhaps not being regularly used or proving difficult to use in practice. Officers on the ground must be able to use the law with confidence. Now, I've no doubt that colleagues will talk at length on the issues, but I'd like to focus my remarks on some of the key concerns raised by the police. Police Scotland raised concerns about the unilateral decision-making outlined in the bill, particularly in relation to DAPNs. They state that the police being able to issue DAPNs without consultation, quote, is not in step with established partnership approach currently taken across public protection to address risk. And they reminded the committee that where emergency measures such as ones outlined in the bill are taken, they are usually done so with a core group of statutory partners who have a key role in decision-making from the outset. Now, Police Scotland proposed that the risk identified must be in line with sexual offence prevention orders, which are well defined. And they consider that other statutory and third-party agencies should be able to apply for a DAPO. They note of the current provisions in Section 8, in which only police can make such an application for an order that, quote, reliance on a single organisation, such as Police Scotland, to apply the legislation not only creates a significant and potentially unmanageable demand on the single service, but is out of step with the established partnership approach in Scotland. And I'm grateful to Scottish Women's Aid, whose helpful briefing today makes a useful suggestion in this regard. Police Scotland also flagged that the time frame for DAPNs creates substantial operational challenges. They flag in their written submission that the necessary IT and information sharing, additional demand on officers who, I think I heard the convener say, spend an average of 9 hours dealing with each domestic incident they attend, and the logistic implications of ensuring legal representation's adherence create substantial challenges for the police, and also require sign-off from a senior officer. Now, we heard in committee, senior officers are typically desk-based and do not routinely attend at the scene, so how this works in practice is key. Furthermore, as the committee recommended, it will be important at Stage 2 to define what a reasonable excuse for breaking a DAPN or a DAPO might be, because there aren't any examples or definitions in the legislation. So in summary, Presiding Officer, these concerns include, but are not limited to, the threshold for evidential proof, something which the Cabinet Secretary has responded to in his letter, but which Scottish Women's Aid make interesting points on, the challenges of risk assessing at the scene, whether there is a conflict with the ECHR, how breaches are to be dealt with and what constitutes a breach, any liability of Police Scotland upon a failure to act, and where DAPNs sit with other court-imposed sanctions or orders relating to children. And perhaps where all that gets us to is that we need reassurances from the Scottish Government that the police will be appropriately resourced to apply the new legislation. They have to be adequately resourced to respond appropriately when assessing and imposing DAPNs or dealing with DAPOs, and then on enforcement. And this will need training, which is a money and a time thing. Now, in his response to the committee's report, the Cabinet Secretary has said he will create an implementation board which will examine how to bring in the proposed new powers of the police and courts against suspected abuse, and it will involve key partners, including Police Scotland. He writes the implementation board will carefully consider what guidance and training is required for police officers and others, and that the operational processes required to enable an application for a DAPO to be prepared in line with the timescale set out in the bill will be considered. And this is good. But leaving aside, I don't see in that the cast-iron commitment to overall resourcing. It feels a bit like it's been backloaded. Why wouldn't this have been done in preparation for the bill? The Cabinet Secretary said in his submission just now he's spoken to the Chief Constable about these issues, but oughtn't that to have been done in advance? And in the same area, I note the Law Society of Scotland, of which I remind the Chamber I'm a member, suggests that what would have helped is prior modelling to identify how and in what circumstances a DAPO would be used to provide effective short-term remedies. They further say that while some of the matters raised in the report, in the committee's report, might be picked up by the implementation board, there needs to be some effective scrutiny, monitoring and evaluation provisions within the bill, including reporting to this Scottish Parliament. So the Scottish Conservatives will support this bill, but the significant concerns about the operational and resource impacts of the bill must be addressed if it is to become law. Otherwise, it could be undermined from the start. So, in conclusion, every effort possible must be taken to prevent domestic abuse. And this bill is another attempt at addressing this vile problem in society. As ever, we will work constructively with the government to achieve that end. This bill seeks to provide victims of domestic abuse with the protection they need, and we are absolutely supportive of that principle. The Scottish Conservatives will always stand up for the victims of crime, and that is why we are very pleased to support this bill at decision time tonight.
Thank you very much, Mr Cairn. I call on Rhoda Grant to open for Labour. Ms Grant, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also add my thanks to the clerks, to Spice, and indeed to the witnesses who all assisted in the committee in reaching their Stage 1 report. We in the Scottish Labour Party support the general principles of the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill. Women and families facing domestic abuse need protection. Too often it is left to them to flee their home and to find their own protection through the courts at their own cost and often with very little knowledge of the justice system. They're often afraid to do this in case it triggers more violence. The point when a relationship is over is often the most dangerous for victims of domestic abuse, and this is frequently the time when abuse can become murder. It is wrong when victims of domestic abuse have to organise their own protection. Our criminal justice system should be there to protect people, and that means everybody. It is a sad reflection on our society that currently this does not happen for victims of domestic abuse. Proving domestic abuse is difficult because it is hard to identify. By its very nature, it is an offence carried out in private within the family home. It is seldom witnessed and takes many forms. Sadly, despite the work of this Parliament and subsequent governments, we still have not seen an end to domestic abuse, and this bill provides the opportunity to put in place another protection. And this is not a new concept. It's used the world over to provide additional protection. It's disappointing, therefore, that the bill is a bit of a dog's dinner. It feels like whoever designed it did not really understand the systems that exist, nor the very nature of domestic abuse. And I sincerely hope that this Parliament will be able to make this legislation workable as it makes its way through stages 2 and 3. Domestic abuse has a detrimental effect on a child's life. Their resilience, their self-esteem are damaged with it, and with that, their life chances. They do not even need to witness it or experience it themselves. The tension and fear that surrounds them creates fear and insecurity within them. While children are offered protection under this bill, this protection is attached to their parent. I truly believe that children must have access to this protection in their own right. The NSPCC reported a 30% increase in referrals to agencies regarding children in abusive households since last April. This at a time when children are more isolated, trapped in abusive households without the respite and support of going out to school. Domestic abuse itself has increased, and therefore the impact on children has increased. If children are contacting agencies for support when they witness domestic abuse at home, surely they themselves should be entitled to protection to have that abusive parent removed. And this happens in other countries such as Australia and New Zealand. It is not used very often, but it can be another protection for children. The nature of domestic abuse is that the victim often covers up the crime because they fear retribution or a total lack of self-esteem which has been removed systematically by the abuser. Therefore, it's important that all victims have the right to this protection. An issue that was raised regarding domestic abuse protection notices and how they interact with orders such as home detention orders or court orders regarding the custody of children needs to be clarified in the legislation. Notices are an emergency intervention. They require no judicial oversight and can be put in place by a senior police officer. Therefore, it needs to be very clear in the legislation how and when these notices take precedence over other orders, especially those handed down by a court. It is right that notices do have precedence in an emergency, but that needs to be clear in the bill. If a domestic abuse protection order is subsequently sought, then there will be oversight by a sheriff and steps can be taken to resolve any conflicts that may occur with orders during the court process. For instance, if the subject of the notice is a home detention order, there will need to be a mechanism for their home base to be changed for implementation of that order. And some witnesses said that to have a notice imposed might indicate a breach of a home detention order and therefore a return to prison might be required. However, given that a notice is only issued where there is no proof of a crime to enable the subject of the notice to be arrested, charged and held in custody, I am unclear how that could be considered as a breach of a home detention order. There are also child custody arrangements which have been imposed through a court, and we need to clarify how they interact with notices. We often hear of terrible cases where child custody and access rights are imposed by the court and that they leave the victim of domestic abuse in life-threatening situations. Access arrangements are often used to continue the abuse, using children as weapons, which not only damages the victim, but also the child. And that is yet another reason for a child to have those protections in their own right. All this needs to be very clear on the face of the bill. It needs to be clear that these notices and orders take precedence over any contact or custody rights of the person subject to them. Notices and orders also bar someone from entering their own home, and there is a reason for that. Too often we see the victim of domestic abuse and their children having to flee their home and become homeless. This bill will help to ensure that they can remain in their own home. However, the bill is unclear on what steps will be taken to ensure the subject of the notice has access to housing immediately if they have nowhere else to go. And this is important, especially if they are subject to a home detention order that keeps them at that home, and also important to avoid homelessness. It is right as well that the abuser is forced to leave their home, because that allows the person who is being abused to remain at home with their family. Presiding Officer, the bill is necessary, but the framing has not been well thought out. I hope the committee, working with the Cabinet Secretary, can put that right at stage 2. because, if in good order, this bill will provide a lifeline to victims of domestic abuse.
Thank you very much, Ms Grant. I now call Liam MacArthur to open for Liberal Democrats. Mr MacArthur.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Scottish Liberal Democrats strongly support any attempt to improve the protection for those at risk of domestic abuse, particularly where they are living with the perpetrator of that abuse. In that context, we will be very happy to support the principles of this bill at decision time today, not least as they broadly reflect the policy adopted by Scottish Liberal Democrats back in 2019. That said, and as others have mentioned, it's clear work is needed to address practical concerns raised by various witnesses at stage one, not least Police Scotland. However, let me start, as others have done, by thanking all those who have helped the committee to get to this point, notably witnesses giving both written and oral evidence, our clerks and Spice. They and we, I have to say, have not been helped by a truncated timeframe for scrutiny referred to by the convener, but given the nature and the complexity of the issues raised by this bill, that is far from ideal, Deputy Presiding Officer. But the principles are sound. They reflect those of the Istanbul Convention and already in place in countries such as the Netherlands, Austria, Germany, Spain, as well as England and Wales, all of whom have introduced short-term protective orders aimed at tackling domestic abuse. In Scotland, as the Cabinet Secretary reminded us, current civil measures place the onus on the victim to apply for orders. Under this bill, police would be able to impose a protection notice and thereafter apply to the court for a protection order, which could place requirements and prohibitions on a suspected perpetrator of domestic abuse. These include removing a suspected perpetrator from a home shared with a person at risk of abuse and prohibiting them from contacting or otherwise abusing the person at risk while the order is in effect. As well as protecting those at risk of domestic abuse, we need to improve outcomes for victims in relation to housing, creating a new ground on which a social landlord can apply to the court to end the tenancy of a perpetrator of abusive behaviour with a view to transferring the tenancy to the victim is another welcome step. This matters. We know there are over 60,000 domestic abuse instances recorded by Police Scotland in 2018-19. At the same time, around 4,500 homelessness applications were made due to a, quote, violent or abusive dispute within a household. The vast majority of those applications were from women, half of whom had children. Domestic abuse is the single biggest reason for a homelessness application by women. Those alarming numbers were on the increase before COVID. Nobody seriously expects that trend to have been reversed during the pandemic. Indeed, quite the reverse, as the NSPCC reported earlier this month. So the provisions of this bill are both welcome and timely. Nevertheless, in a practical sense, as the committee heard repeatedly, the bill, as drafted, lacks clarity. The Law Society cite a risk of, quote, proliferation of potentially overlapping measures. Indeed, the government acknowledged the existing criminal and civil law provisions that could be used to remove a suspected perpetrator of abuse. Thresholds for DAPNs also give rise to concerns, with the Law Society given the evidential basis required for police to take such a step. This would need to be proportionate to be consistent with an individual's ECHR rights. But DAPN can only be imposed by a senior police officer at the rank of inspector or above. How would this work in practice? There was also some disquiet over the threshold for taking action, as reasonable grounds to believe is at odds with the existing threshold, opening up the potential for confusion. While this is not a power that witnesses expected to be used extensively, greater clarity is nevertheless essential. On the question of what the maximum duration of a DAPO should be, the committee heard mixed views. Scottish Women's Rights Centre and Scottish Women's Aid argued the proposed 3-month period was too short, but concerns were also expressed about the ECHR implications of going beyond that, which I and committee colleagues certainly understood and sympathised. On whether consent of those deemed at risk should be sought before implementing a DAPN or a DAPO, this may be problematic. The committee heard compelling evidence, though, about the need to ensure women's voices are heard and reflected in the process, and the bill will need to find a way of achieving this. And while an automatic referral to support organisations may be a step too far, presumption or even an opt-out provision, as proposed by Scottish Women's Aid, does not seem unreasonable. Police Scotland assured the committee that such referrals routinely take place. Placing such a provision in the bill may offer further reassurance. Finally, I think the point made by the Shetland Domestic Abuse Partnership about the age thresholds is one that deserves further consideration. A perpetrator need not be 18 or over and can be as young as 16, and I think the bill needs to reflect that fact. This is also a reminder that domestic abuse sadly blights every community across Scotland. In my own constituency, Takistan, Orkney, it does happen here. It effectively says it all, and I commend them for the work that they do in encouraging the reporting of abuse. Deputy Presiding Officer, this is an important bill that can deliver real improvements for those affected by domestic abuse. However, changes are needed at stage 2 to give it the clarity, certainty and scope it requires to be effective. I look forward to working with committee colleagues to achieve that goal. In the meantime, Scottish Liberal Democrats will, of course, be supporting this bill at decision time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms McArthur. And I call on John Finney to open for the Green Party. Mr Finney, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And like colleagues, the usual thanks to everyone that's brought us to this point. I want to say at the outset that the legitimate criticism of this bill is not at odds with my unequivocal support to address the scourge of domestic abuse. Like others on the committee, I've been active in the field and declare an interest as a member of the cross-party group of men's violence against women and girls. However, we don't make laws for the sake of it. We want to make good law, effective law, law that's evidence is being needed, law that will make a positive difference. Domestic Abuse Scotland Act 2018 was covered by the Justice Committee, and that overhauled the criminal justice approach. And it did identify a gap, and that gap was, and I quote here, keeping a perpetrator away from home. So that does equate to a need for a law. And of course, that stems from the Istanbul Convention, which the Scottish Government expressed in their commitment to equally safe, and that states that there should be legislative measures to ensure that in situations of immediate danger, a perpetrator of domestic violence is required to vacate the residence and prohibit the perpetrator from entering the residence of or contacting the victim or person at risk. Now, that approach is necessary and seems very straightforward. Unfortunately, this legislation, or at least its application, isn't. Police Scotland seem uncertain how they might use the power. They talk about exceptional circumstances. Members of Parliament scrutinising legislation need to understand how it will work. Policy aims are very clear, protecting a person from immediate risk, and that's good, and the bill could do that. But what if the alleged perpetrator has left the scene? What role does the bill have for that? Do police have power to detain pending the granting of a DAPN? Is such a power in the bill or elsewhere? It's talking about the policy aim of creating time for any further legal steps, but the time frames are tight. It's the next lawful day. What if following the granting of a notice, the court decides not to grant an order? Been alluded to by other members, the Law Society talk about the risk of proliferation of overlapping measures, and it's fair to say that Scottish Women's Aid don't see it like that. They say that these measures are not intended to replace existing criminal measures. And a routine criminal justice response should always be the first consideration. They say it's for a very specific situation in which it is not possible to use criminal justice measures. If that's the case, one might reasonably ask, what happens at the moment in the circumstances in which this bill is intended to work? Nothing? Hopefully not. And if there is a gap, and I think we accept there is, does this bill fit the gap? The policy memorandum of the bill itself talks about a number of existing criminal and civil law provisions currently in effect, which can be used to remove a suspected perpetrator of abuse from a home they share with a person at risk and otherwise prevent contacting a person at risk. My wish, the committee's wish, is to understand where these proposals fit with the existing arrangements. Another policy aim to reduce the chances that the person at risk becomes homeless or feels that he or she, rather than the suspected perpetrator, must find a new to live. What of the suspected perpetrator? Someone for whom there may be insufficient evidence to arrest, someone for whom may not be subject to investigative deliberations, some from whom there may be insufficient evidence to take to court, is a police officer to deny that individual their residence. Now, the Scottish Government
in the response there, I would like to take this opportunity to clarify that a senior constable in making a DAPN will not be acting as a court of law. Really? It seems to me that that's not a particularly helpful response. I would argue that acting as a court of law is exactly what the bill is asks officers to do. That's precisely why there must be no debate about what's expected of them, what proof, what evidence is needed. I say again, sanctioning police to advise an uncharged, unconvicted person, someone who may be subject to no other civil or criminal restraints, where they can go, who they can engage with, where they can stay, is a big step. Every police officer has to justify their decision-making, has to explain the rationale, particularly in placing restrictions on citizens. An officer will ask themselves, what are my powers? In what circumstances can I exercise them? And of course, what's the right of redress for the individual? The policy notes do talk about the likely interference with rights, and that's been touched on with others. So in the limited time, I acknowledge that that is covered. But of course, the Justice Committee had significant concerns about the practicalities of Police Scotland being able to use powers in the way they're intended. Now, the Cabinet Secretary tells us there's further consultation with Police Scotland about how the powers can be used. The British Government should be well down the road from there. Compelling evidence from Police Scotland and the Law Society and others that further consultation and clarity is required on how these DAPNs are expected to work is actually quite a serious criticism of being at this stage of the legislative process. In relation to breaches, we're told by the Scottish Government response, I consider the bill as clear. If clear, can the Cabinet Secretary outline what legal power there would be to detain someone who was not under arrest pending the issue of a DAPN? My mind works in the like flowcharts. I like to know what the options are, and if it was laid out in that way, or as the Law Society more correctly put it, prior modelling to identify how and in what circumstances, that would be very helpful. I'm conscious of time, Presiding Officer. It's reasonable to expect greater clarity about this legislation. These are exceptional powers, and we're told they'll be used in exceptional circumstances. It may be that I'm very slow in the uptake. A sample scenario would be of great help. Of course, the reality for victims is very bleak, and the bill can play a part in resolving that, but only if we resolve all these issues. And I'll leave it there. Decision Time Party will be supporting it.
Thank you very much, Mr Finney. I do remind members there's a little time in hand to run over their time. Rona Mackay, open debate. Rona Mackay, followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It cannot be overstated how important the bill we're debating today is to the victims of domestic abuse, and I'll be more than happy to pass the general principles at stage 1 today. Firstly, can I thank the clerks and the bill team for their exceptional work in preparing the stage 1 report within an extremely tight timeframe. There's much ground to cover in the detail of this bill, but I know that what I can't cover, colleagues will pick up in their contributions, and indeed many already have. The Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill is indeed a milestone. Orders issued will provide emergency safety measures to victims, 80% of whom are women and children, by removing the alleged perpetrator from the home and barring contact with the person at risk. It is a safety net for those who so desperately need one, and it will improve the outcomes for housing victims by giving social landlords the power to end the tenancy of a perpetrator. Domestic abuse is the main cause of women's homelessness in Scotland. Crucially, it gives the police the power to issue a domestic abuse protection notice ahead of applying to the civil court for a domestic abuse protection order. The significance of this is huge. It means the victim at her most vulnerable does not have to go through the court process herself and doesn't incur legal costs. Of course, these orders are not intended to replace existing criminal measures, but they will protect victims in cases where it's not possible to apply this, but there is an imminent risk to safety. Presiding Officer, evidence received by the committee questioned whether there was a legislative gap to fill, given that we have non-harassment orders, civil protection orders and emergency barring orders. My view is that there most definitely is, and that these orders will fill that gap, providing immediate safety to victims by removing the perpetrator and barring further contact. Until now, it's traditionally been women and children who are forced to leave the family home in cases of domestic abuse. This is unfair and inhumane for both the victim and the children. To be uprooted from their home, school and familiar surroundings through no fault of their own. They are guilty of nothing, yet they pay the price. That's why these orders are so important and necessary, particularly now with levels of domestic abuse soaring during the pandemic. Dr Marcia Scott, Chief Executive of Scottish Women's Aid, said the publication of this bill is a milestone moment for women, children and young people experiencing domestic abuse, who for years have asked us why it should be them rather than their abusers who have had to leave their homes, pets and belongings to seek safety. Presiding Officer, in its Stage 1 report, the committee spoke of real operational concerns in respect of Police Scotland. The convener and other speakers have articulated many of those well, so I won't repeat them here. However, I am extremely pleased that the Cabinet Secretary has said he'll continue to engage with Police Scotland and key stakeholders to discuss their concerns. Good legislation must be workable legislation. To that end, the Cabinet Secretary has confirmed that he will set up a Scottish Government-chaired implementation board to examine all matters relating to operational matters if the bill is passed. Presiding Officer, the timing and length of DAPNs and DAPOs featured heavily in our evidence taking. In order to be ECHR compliant, there is a short timescale for the Senior Constable proposing the DAPN order to apply for a court order, and the committee accepts this. The duration of a DAPO is a maximum of 3 months with some flexibility for extension in certain circumstances. And again, we believe that this is reasonable given that these are emergency orders, although there may be issues around eviction and rehousing, and this could be addressed at Stage 2. Presiding Officer, I am passionate about this bill and I'm particularly delighted that a breach of an order is a criminal offence. One of those breaches would be stalking by a partner or ex-partner where an order has been issued. More than half of stalking offences are committed by an ex-partner. In 2019, I introduced a Members' Bill proposal to introduce stalking protection orders which the police could apply for on behalf of the victim. The proposal was paused in order to evaluate the effect of the newly introduced Domestic Abuse Scotland Bill. If the bill we are debating today is passed, another legislative gap will be filled, and I couldn't be happier. However, we know that stalking usually takes place over a period of time and may last longer than 3 months if no arrest has been made. So I will consider bringing forward an amendment at Stage 2 to ask that the order is eligible for extension in cases of stalking breaches. Section 4 of the bill relates to the police paying attention to the victim, quotes, only when they are aware of the woman's views. Presiding Officer, I believe women and children's views should be actively sought, as should the consent of the woman to an order. To issue an order without consent would be to further disempower the victim. In a case where coercion is suspected, and that is very often the case, an interim order could be issued without consent to allow time for further investigation with a view to taking criminal action. In relation to the evidential threshold for issuing an order, as the Cabinet Secretary has outlined, women's organisations have expressed concern over the wording of significant harm in the government's response to the committee, and I'm sure this is something else that could be addressed at Stage 2. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, there is so much to welcome in this bill. At last, abused women and children will have emergency protection that has so far been lacking, a safety net for them and any children involved. There are issues to be resolved, as we've heard, but I know that the government will work with stakeholders to make this vital piece of legislation work for everyone. We owe it to so many silent victims living in fear. Presiding Officer, this legislation is the beginning of the end for perpetrators of abuse, and I urge members to pass the general principles at decision time today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Mackay. I now call Rachel Hamilton to be followed by Fulton McGregor. Ms Hamilton, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill at Stage 1 here today. Scottish Conservatives will always stand up for victims of abuse and support the general principles of the bill. Scottish Women's Aid and the Law Society, to name a few, have welcomed the bill's proposed powers, which are intended to fill a gap in legislation, or as my colleague Adam Tompkins said, sharpen the effectiveness of the tools we have for those who may be experiencing abuse. This with an aim to reduce the risk that a person has to make themselves homeless, provide them with a safe pathway to other forms of safety. Sadly, we know domestic abuse is on the rise in Scotland. The number of domestic abuse incidents recorded by Police Scotland has been rising in the last 3 years, from 58,108 in 2015-16 to 60,642 in 2018-19. It is concerning that we see the number of incidences rising. However, as I've previously said in this chamber, it must be looked through the prism that perhaps more victims feel confident and empowered to come forward. I want to thank the important work of my local women's refuge, Border Women's Aid in Hoyk, who have worked tirelessly to help other women gain freedom from abusive relationships. They provide safe accommodation and specialist support for up to a year for women and their children who have left abusive homes. Through their excellent outreach service, they support many women in the community currently living with abuse while they plan for a life beyond. We've come a long way in supporting victims. However, there is still a lot more work to be done. I believe that legislation must go further in tackling some of the issues of domestic abuse that occur post-separation, and I will touch on these later in my contribution. However, I want to make two main points today in relation to the bill at this stage and how we can further strengthen it to help assist and empower victims. Many other members in the chamber today have discussed both of these issues, and firstly, we welcome the two new powers for courts to make a domestic abuse protection order and for the police to make a domestic abuse protection notice, but have concerns about their implementation. I want to thank my colleague Liam Kerr for raising these points in the 2018 bill. He proposed an amendment to the bill which would have called for a review of measures that would have, amongst other things, excluded someone from a person's house if they presented an immediate danger to the other person or child. The Justice Committee, the Law Society of Scotland and Police Scotland have noted issues with the current drafting of these powers. The Law Society have questioned Section 4 of the bill and whether a DAPN is a proportionate measure in the context of the relevant rights under the European Convention on Human Rights. It remains uncertain how a DAPN will be issued in practice, and the bill does not appear to have a specific power available to the police to remove a suspected perpetrator to the police station relating to a DAPN. The committee have noticed these concerns and they will have to be dealt with at stage 2 and through proper consultation with Police Scotland to ensure that the new powers are fit for purpose and effective. Secondly, if I may, I'd like to touch on the important issue of financial abuse, especially post-separation. We know that when a victim leaves a perpetrator, there can still be ties which unfortunately link them to that person. Lack of money and financial resources is the main reason why women return to abusive partners post-separation, and economic barriers and a lack of financial independence are the main factors in women staying in those abusive relationships. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men in the UK have experienced financial abuse from a current or former partner, according to the Cooperative Bank and Refuge, and 1/3 of victims didn't tell anyone at the time. We know the UK government has provided 22 million in support of domestic abuse and sexual violence in the community access support services and 10 million for domestic abuse safe accommodation charities, which has helped many people in difficult situations. Just this week in the House of Lords, Baroness Lister has been instrumental in bringing amendments to the committee stage of the UK Domestic Abuse Bill. Her amendments seek to ensure that those who were previously personally connected with protected from any coercive and controlling behaviour, including economic abuse that occurs post-separation. Post-separation coercive and controlling financial abuse is widely recognised. I am glad that banks such as the Bank of Scotland and RBS have been supportive of victims and set out guidance and best practice for employees on how to treat sensitive situations, such as victims accessing bank accounts or closing accounts with abusive partners. In the Domestic Abuse Scotland 2018 Act, there are provisions to cover coercive behaviour, even if they are ex-partners. Under this new Domestic Abuse Bill, Section 3(3)(c) refers to controlling, regulating or monitoring person B's day-to-day activities. I'm not a member of the Justice Committee. However, I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary in his closing remarks could clarify if financial abuse post-separation is covered in this bill and if the new notices and orders are able to deal with coercive financial abuse post-separation. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, we on these benches support the general principles of the bill. Nonetheless, there are issues which require addressing. Concurred by my colleague Liam Kerr, many stakeholders, such as Police Scotland, have significant concerns about the operational and resource impacts of the bill. These must be addressed if the bill is to become law. Otherwise, it could potentially undermine any convictions that take place under the bill. What is crucial to the efficacy of this bill and the tackling of domestic abuse is the proper financing and resourcing of our police force to ensure that they can continue their good work. I urge the SNP government to make sure our police officers are fully equipped to root out this evil, which continues to be a scourge on our society. The support groups, charities and victims of domestic abuse are what need to be listened so that the Scottish Government can get this right. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Ms Hamilton. Now call Fulton McGregor, followed by Pauline McNeill. Mr McGregor, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Justice Committee, it gives me great pleasure to speak in this bill today. As we have heard, this bill builds upon the important legislation that came into force last year and allows police and prosecutors the powers to ensure that those who participate in coercive or controlling behaviour that are held accountable for their actions. And make no mistake that such behaviour is domestic abuse and it is now treated as such. Presiding Officer, cases are going up and that should not be surprising. It may not necessarily represent higher prevalence, but rather people feeling more able to report and a clear message from this government and from society that it will not be tolerated. And that is something that we should welcome. However, in addition, this bill will offer additional protection to those at risk of domestic abuse, especially in cases where they are living with the abuser. Someone should feel safe in their own home, and it couldn't be more timely than now during these times of lockdown when we cannot leave our homes. Yes, more money and restriction exemptions have been put in place to support those suffering the reality, but the reality still remains that lockdown negatively impacts victims of domestic abuse. These might be about concerns about household mixing and virus transmissions, meaning that options to move in with other family and friends may not be as readily available as they usually would be. People may be unclear if they can leave a situation or may even be told by an abuser that they cannot. Kids not being in school, as we've already heard from Rona Mackay, and of course the massive strain on our emergency services. All of this means that many victims are suffering in silence, and now even more so at this time. Presiding Officer, this new bill will apply to all those at risk of domestic abuse, but we do know that women are disproportionately affected, representing around 80% of victims. The Scottish Government is determined to protect everyone from domestic abuse and at the same time will continue to implement the Equally Safe strategy with a focus on supporting women and children at risk of abuse. With this new bill, police and courts will gain powers to remove suspected abusers from victims' homes, ban them from re-entering under new legislation. A domestic abuse protection order will now come into force if this bill passes, allowing courts to impose requirements upon suspected perpetrators. The order will allow for the removal of a suspected perpetrator when they share it with someone at risk and contact will no longer be allowed. The bill also provides power for the police where necessary to impose a very short-term domestic abuse protection notice ahead of applying to the court for a DAPO. The DAPN, the protection notice, is intended to be very short-term in its effect, lasting until the court reaches a decision about whether to impose a DAPO or an interim DAPO. The bill proposes that a DAPO could last for up to 3 months in total, as we've already heard. In committee, we heard from witnesses in support of this, including Scottish Women's Aid, the Scottish Women's Rights Centre and Professor Mandy Burton of the University of Leicester, who all believe that there is a need for new powers, as in their view, a gap does exist currently in the protection afforded to women under existing powers. Another aspect of the bill, which is quite groundbreaking, is social landlords will now have the powers to end or transfer a tenancy of a perpetrator of domestic abuse to prevent a victim becoming homeless and enabling them to remain in the family home. Tenants affected by domestic abuse should not have to leave their family home. We all agree on that. It is often the case, though, that children are also shared in such a situation and thus make it harder for someone to find suitable accommodation, and the upheaval can be deeply traumatic on top of what has already taken place. It is recognised that by allowing for a transfer of tenancy, victims and their families will be able to stay in their home without having to seek temporary accommodation or declare themselves homeless. Many victims indeed will stay in a relationship with their abusers due to the fact that they have nowhere to go and cannot fathom the ordeal of leaving their home and finding suitable accommodation. This part of the bill will help put a stop to that and help redress this imbalance that has been around for some time. As we have already heard, however, there are, of course, some issues to be discussed further at committee. The bill is not the finished article, and I think it's fair that we need to say that, and every speaker, including the Cabinet Secretary, has reflected on that today. For example, there have been concerns raised over the suggested level of the evidential threshold, which would enable a domestic abuse protection order or a domestic abuse protection notice to be made. And the Justice Secretary, as we've heard, has confirmed a Scottish Government-led board will be established to ensure the effective implementation of proposed new measures to protect victims of domestic abuse. There were also concerns, as we've heard from several speakers, around significant operational and resourcing challenges for Police Scotland, and I'm also delighted that the Cabinet Secretary has indicated that there will be ongoing with Police Scotland on these issues, because from the evidence we hear will quite clearly be required. Shared parents in Scotland have raised concerns around the compatibility with human rights, as we've also heard from the convener and others, including that the alleged perpetrator, who is subject to a DAPN or a DAPO, may or may not have actually committed the offence. And I think those with these concerns can be reassured today in this debate that they have been heard and considered by the committee, but also understand that we need to balance these concerns against not doing more to protect victims and the devastating consequences that can occur when we do not act decisively. So much like the previous domestic abuse legislation that this committee looked at, it's important for people to know that the committee does take into account all these issues, but we have to have balance when doing that. And also, as we've heard, Women's Aid have played an instrumental role, Presiding Officer, in the development of this bill, and I've made some further recommendations to members to improve it, and these include in Section 1, strengthening the definition on application of DAPNs, in Section 4, a more robust duty to actively seek views of women and, where practical, children, and appropriate wording around the test and thresholds of imminent risk. In Section 8, a more robust duty to actively seek views of children, the need for consent of women, and amendment to categories of applicant for a DAPO. And finally, they suggest in Section 9, Section 13 and Section 18, extending the duration of DAPOs to allow Section 18 proceedings to conclude. But we have also heard concerns about that, as Liam MacArthur pointed out. However, I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's engagement with Scottish Women's Aid on these issues, and I do think that given their expertise in this area, that going into stage 2, we need to consider all of these suggestions very carefully as we move the bill through Parliament. Presiding Officer, I'm not actually sure of my time because I'm at home and I've not set a clock, so my apologies, but I will conclude by saying that I'm confident that this bill will make much needed changes to the lives of victims of domestic abuse, and I would urge members to support the general principles at decision time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Pauline McNeill to be followed by Shona Robinson.
Presiding Officer, first of all, thanks to the Justice Committee for their close scrutiny of this important piece of legislation. The pandemic has sparked a plague of domestic violence that the UN has called a shadow pandemic. We're told to stay at home and stay safe, but unfortunately, for a lot of women, their home is not safe. Close the Gap note that 1 in 4 women experience domestic violence in their lifetime. And it's not just physical abuse that women are often subjected to, as we've heard from other members. It's coercive control too, and the 2018 bill sought to criminalise that control, a very significant development in the law. The lockdown inadvertently has given abusers the means to further restrict their partner's freedom and threaten their safety. Women's Aid reports that 2/3 of survivors identifying as currently experiencing abuse told the organisation that their abuse has started during lockdown restrictions or the COVID-19 virus as its consequences. The existing system of civil protection orders in Scotland offers predominantly longer-term protection to the person at risk, and what the bill seeks to do is add new immediate or short-term powers, so to add the legal resource for people at risk of domestic abuse. This bill brings us into step with a range of other countries such as England, Wales, the Netherlands, Austria, Germany and Spain, as other members have identified, which have introduced short-term protective orders aimed at tackling domestic abuse. And the bill proposes 2 new powers, which do not require the consent of the person at risk to be exercised. The power available to a senior police officer to impose a domestic abuse protection notice, a DAPN, on a suspected perpetrator of abuse. The power available to the civil court on application by the police to grant a domestic abuse protection order in relation to the perpetrator of abuse. And the bill proposes that it would last up to 3 months in total. These new powers would only have legal effect in Scotland, but not the rest of the United Kingdom. As we've heard, while the vast majority of victims of domestic abuse are women, children are also victims too. Children experience both short and long-term cognitive, behavioural and emotional effects as a result of witnessing domestic abuse. And only this week it has been reported that the NSPCC is concerned that over the pandemic period, the risk of young people suffering terrible consequences of domestic abuse has intensified. And increasingly, the NSPCC helpline for adults are worried about children, and have heard from neighbours reporting and hearing children crying and incessant arguing in nearby homes. The average monthly number of referrals over domestic abuse from the NSPC to Scottish agencies like the police and local authorities has risen from 32 in the first 3 months of the last year to 42 in the last few months. And it calls on the NSPC helpline, which has risen by over 50% across the UK. Joanna Barrett from NSPCC Scotland said this week, the families facing increasing pressures behind closed doors and lockdown restrictions have made some children more vulnerable to experiencing domestic abuse, as well as others. We believe that the protections in the bill need to apply equally to children who may have themselves be direct victims of abuse. Part 2 of the bill, section 18, that others have mentioned, proposes a new power for social landlords to end a tenant's interest in a tenancy where there has been domestic abuse. And this was a matter that was brought to my attention by the Chartered Institute of Housing and Scottish Women's Aid. So this section is to help tenants affected by domestic abuse remain in a family home and help avoid a move into temporary emergency accommodation. And I want to note the contribution of the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group, as well as Scottish Women's Aid, as I said, who've done incredible work in this area. Dr Marcia Scott, Chief Executive of Scottish Women's Aid, said that domestic abuse is the leading cause of women's homelessness in Scotland, a point made by Liam MacArthur as well. They've long said emergency protective orders will make an immediate and significant difference for those women and children, offering respite and breathing space as they seek support and safety. So the role of landlords is key in this, but I think, as other members have said, it's one of the aspects of the bill that does need tested to make sure that it's compliant with human rights law. And I do have a question for ministers in closing, if they could clarify whether, if the perpetrator is removed from the home, what would happen as there's an obligation to house them. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I support the general principles of this legislation. Once again, I think the Scottish Parliament has shown that it's leading the way in challenging domestic abuse, the women and children and others affected by domestic abuse. And I think this legislation, as it goes through Parliament, through its scrutiny, will make a very significant contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Shona Robertson.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, like others, can I begin by thanking the Justice Committee clerks for all their hard work on this bill so far, and also the witnesses who have provided extremely valuable evidence to our committee. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the importance of protecting women and girls who find themselves isolated and vulnerable due to the actions of an abusive partner. The stay-at-home message has been particularly difficult for many women who are victims of domestic abuse, as their home is not a safe place for them to be. In the year 2018-2019, reported incidents rose by around 2%, but in the early part of 2020, particularly during the first lockdown period, due to the pandemic, incidents were 9% higher than the equivalent period the previous year. This new bill will apply to all those at risk of domestic abuse, but we know women are disproportionately affected, representing 80% of victims. And of course, it builds on previous legislation coming into force last year, giving police and prosecutors greater powers to target those who engage in coercive or controlling behaviour. A person's home should be a place of safety, and the new orders being introduced will give victims of domestic abuse the space and time to address their longer-term safety and housing situation. The bill creates additional protection for people who are at risk of domestic abuse, particularly where they are living with their abuser. The police and courts will gain powers to remove suspected abusers from victims' homes and ban them from re-entering under new legislation. The bill will also allow social landlords to end or transfer a tenancy of a perpetrator of domestic abuse to prevent a victim becoming homeless and enabling them to remain in the family home. This was welcomed by Dr Marsha Scott from Women's Aid, who said, "Domestic abuse is the leading cause of women's homelessness in Scotland, with women often facing the impossible choice between living with an abuser and making themselves and their children homeless." The bill creates additional protection for people who are at risk of domestic abuse by trying to fill a gap by allowing immediate protection for a short term for a person experiencing domestic abuse in order to keep them safe while they work out their next steps. The police and courts will gain powers to remove suspected abusers from victims' homes by providing courts with the new power to make a domestic abuse protection order, which can impose requirements and prohibitions on a suspected perpetrator of domestic abuse. This, as I said earlier, includes removing them from a home they share with a person at risk and prohibiting them from contacting or otherwise abusing the person at risk while the order is in effect. And the bill also provides a... Yes, of course.
Liam Kerr.
I'm very grateful to the member. I just wonder where she is on whether consideration should be given to allowing third-party organisations such as victims groups to file an application for DAPO.
Yeah, I have some sympathy for that. I think it's something that we need to explore further to make sure, like, which organisations would that be, and that wouldn't be without its difficulties. But I think it's something as a committee we should explore further. The bill also provides a power for the police, where necessary, to impose a very short-term domestic abuse protection notice ahead of applying to the court for a DAPO. Bernardo Scotland said that they welcomed the measures contained in the bill and that the new legislation would protect and safeguard victims and their families. They stated that often abuse victims don't want to move out of the home because they don't want their children to experience upheaval. It's imperative that, where possible, the perpetrator is held to account and removed from the family home. The bill also allows social landlords to end or transfer the tenancy of a perpetrator of domestic abuse to prevent a victim becoming homeless and enabling them to remain in the family home. And Part 2 of the bill proposes a new power for social landlords to do just that. The bill is intended to help improve the immediate and long-term housing outcomes for domestic abuse victims who live in social housing. And I think that is something that is extremely valuable by creating a new ground on which a social landlord can apply to the court to end the tenancy. Alternatively, an application can be made to end the perpetrator's interest in the tenancy where the perpetrator and victim are joint tenants and enable the victim to remain in the family home. So these are important measures. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I am pleased that the Justice Committee has backed the general principles of the proposed legislation, while of course highlighting some of the issues to be considered further and of course making recommendations about how the enhanced protective orders would operate effectively. I want to welcome the commitment given by the Cabinet Secretary for Justice to establish an implementation board to ensure that there is clear guidance on the use of this legislation. As mentioned by the Cabinet Secretary himself and other members, there are issues requiring further consideration, one of which includes concerns over the suggested level of the evidential threshold, which would enable a domestic abuse protection order or a domestic abuse protection notice to be made. Others concerned operational matters, particularly raised by Police Scotland, as other members have already referred to. So I do welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to continue to have discussions with stakeholders around their concerns about this and other matters raised in the Stage 1 report as the bill progresses to the next stage.
Thank you very much. We now move to closing speeches, and I call on Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It has been an interesting debate, and what is very clear is that this bill is required and it has the potential to save lives, so we need to get it right. It has unanimous support, but also there are concerns expressed around the Chamber about how it has been drafted and how it will work in practice. John Finney asked if this bill fills a gap, and sadly there is a gap that needs to be filled, with victims often being forced to leave home and become homeless because they have suffered abuse. And many will return home unable to cope with the homelessness, and the abuse continues. Indeed, if anything, it gets worse because the perpetrator knows their victim has no other options. And as Shona Robson said, many just simply stay anyway because they cannot face the homelessness that could occur if they decide to leave. A number of speakers talked about the evidential threshold for using a DAPN or a DAPO. Many spoke about how people would know when those should be used and whether or not significant harm should be an issue. And I believe that that bar is far too high. I agree with Rona Mackay when she calls for caution about setting a bar. How can we define significant harm? I believe that if there is a reason to suspect that domestic abuse has occurred or will occur, then a notice must be put in place. Pauline McNeill pointed out that the notices cover coercive control as well, and therefore any threshold put in place needs to take that into account. I, like others, welcome the Implementation Board to work through the concerns, but this needs to happen. Indeed, this should have happened before the bill was put in place, but it has to happen before stage 2. I think it was Liam Kerr who said it should have been done well in advance of this bill, and I agree with that. A number of speakers raised the issues that surround dealing with, that have to be dealt with in the implementation of this bill, the things that just simply do not work. Liam Kerr talked about police concerns, about the lack of partnership working, and whether or not who can apply for extensions. The DAPN is issued by an inspector or above, and that caused concerns because it was pointed out that an inspector would very seldom attend a report of domestic abuse. But perhaps this provides the checks and balances within the system, because the constable who would then attend the complaint regarding domestic abuse would have to go back to the inspector and persuade them that a notice needed to be put in place, and persuade them that they suspected that there was a risk to the victim of domestic abuse if that notice was not in place. So, however, those things have not really been laid out in the bill, so people are left wondering how it will actually work in practice. So the Implementation Board needs to deal with this and deal with it quickly, so that we can make sure that the bill actually is fit for purpose and it does what it is supposed to do. A number of speakers also talked about the views of children and how the views not only of the victim but of the child are sought before a notice or order are put in place. With regard to a notice, this is almost impossible. Those are emergency situations where a notice is placed. But certainly before an order is put in place, the sheriff must seek the views of children and indeed of the victim of domestic abuse. And this has to be done in a way that doesn't further traumatise a child. And I'm glad that the Cabinet Secretary is looking at this. Pauline McNeill talked, and indeed so did Liam MacArthur, about the NSPCC findings and the need for protection of children. And it is quite frightening that the increase in the number of children that are seeking help due to domestic abuse during the pandemic. We must put in protection in place for them, and I believe they should be protected in their own right under this legislation. A number of speakers also talked about human rights. Adam Tompkins asked the question if these provisions were in keeping with human rights, and I believe that they are, and they are certainly in keeping with the Istanbul Convention, which the Scottish Government has signed up to. The Domestic Abuse Protection Order goes to court, so it does have judicial oversight. And the subject of that order can also make representations to that court, and therefore their human rights are not being in any way impinged. There was concerns that the length of time for both the notice and order could lead to human rights violations. The notice goes to court very, very quickly, and indeed the police expressed concerns about how quickly this needed to happen. But given that there is no judicial oversight of the notice, the sooner it is in court, I think, the better. But the order certainly has to be long enough to allow the victim to find protection in their own right and have that put in place. Pauline McNeill also talked about removing someone from their own home and whether it was within their human rights that they would need to be rehoused. Now, we need to remember that this bill is put in place because women and children are being forced out of their own homes by domestic abuse on a daily basis. So therefore, redressing the balance to make sure it's the perpetrator that leaves is the right thing to do. But do the police have a responsibility to make sure that person is not homeless? I think we need to consider that also at stage 2 of this bill. And with that, Presiding Officer, I simply say that we are in support of the general principles of this bill and will vote for it at decision time tonight.
Thank you very much. I now call Margaret Mitchell.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I thank the Justice Committee and clerks for the Stage 1 report and scrutiny of this extremely important Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill. To put it in context, sadly, despite all the efforts to the contrary, domestic abuse is still very much with us, and worse still, on the increase, with incidents recorded by Police Scotland rising in the last 3 years. More concerning still is the fact that during lockdown, abuse is known to increase dramatically as victims of domestic abuse are trapped with their abusers. While we are all encouraged to stay home and keep safe to help tackle the pandemic, the unpalatable truth is home is not safe for everyone. When the abuse, whether physical and/or coercive and controlling, becomes intolerable, victims are forced to flee the family home, with all the disruption, anxiety, and practical difficulties that entails, including finding themselves and their children potentially homeless. Under the existing civil law, where someone seeks protection from domestic abuse and to keep the perpetrator away from the home, this can only be achieved if the perpetrator enters the criminal justice system or the person at risk applies for a civil court order against the perpetrator. The bill seeks to fill what has been described a gap in the law by improving the protections available for those in a coercive, controlling relationship at risk of domestic abuse, particularly where they're living with the perpetrator. The bill provides the courts with a new power to make domestic abuse protection orders, EAPOs. These orders can prohibit a suspected perpetrator from contacting or otherwise abusing the person at risk when the order is in effect. And the police, where necessary, have the power to impose a very short-term domestic protection notice in advance of an application to the court for a DAPO. Abusive behaviour is defined as behaviour a reasonable person would consider likely to cause physical or psychological harm. The list of abusive behaviour is non-exhaustive and can include a single incident or a constant pattern of abusive action. The bill creates a new ground for social landlords to apply to the court to end the tenancy of the perpetrator of abusive behaviour with a view to transferring the tenancy to the victim. or to end the perpetrator's interest in the tenancy where the perpetrator and the victim have a joint tenancy and enable the victim to remain at home. These are good measures aimed to avoid homelessness and improve the immediate and long-term social sector housing outcomes of domestic abuse victims. However, various stakeholders have pointed out that the 3-month maximum DAPO timescale may be too short to ensure eviction proceedings can be completed. Furthermore, Police Scotland has stressed that DAPNs and DAPOs, which require the perpetrator to leave the home they share with the victim, should only be used where absolutely necessary and not routinely, and that how often and exactly when and where they will be used needs to be clear. Additionally, there are some concerns that in seeking to provide this improved protection for victims, the rights of suspected perpetrators may be infringed in terms of the European Convention of Human Rights. Consequently, while the Bill's objectives are most certainly welcome to ensure adequate protection for victims from their abusers, the concerns of key stakeholders which have been raised must be addressed. For example, Section 4 provides only a senior police officer is able to issue a DAPM. Police Scotland and the Law Society have questioned how this would work in practice. As senior officers are generally desk-bound and rarely at the scene of a domestic abuse incident. Also, the senior officer must have reasonable grounds to believe there has been abusive behaviour and to issue a DAPN. The Law Society questioned what reasonable grounds means in practice. Would it mean, would a neighbour's anonymous tip-off be sufficient even if the victim disputes the claim? Any DAPN test must clearly then be carefully considered. Section 7 and 16 provide it's an offence to breach a DAPN and DAPO respectively without reasonable excuse. No explanation or examples are given as to what would constitute a reasonable excuse for breaching a DAPO or a DAPN. But breach offences can result in not only a fine, but a prison sentence, and clarification here is therefore essential. Police Scotland has legitimate concerns that officers could be held liable for failing to issue a DAPN when required or wrongly issuing one, and it's been stressed the need for further training and guidance for police officers and that police are adequately resourced to, as Women's Aid state, ensure the effective implementation of the bill. Deputy Presiding Officer, the Scottish Conservatives know just how important this bill is to victims of domestic abuse and wholeheartedly support the general principles, but consider it will require considerable revision. The significant concerns about how some provisions will work in practice cannot be left to an implementation bog to resolve and must be addressed at stages 2 and 3 in order to ensure the bill protects domestic abuse victims to best effect and that police officers are sufficiently resourced and trained to properly discharge the extensive new powers this legislation gives them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Humza Yousaf to wind up the debate on behalf of the Government. Humza Yousaf.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I welcome what has been a very good debate, welcome the contributions from right across the Chamber, and welcome the fact that we've heard from each and every member that they will be supporting the bill, the general principles of the bill, during this stage 1 debate and that decision time today, for which I am grateful. I'm also grateful for their feedback. I know that in the midst of a global pandemic, perhaps it is difficult to have the usual conversations we would around a bill. The process has undoubtedly been truncated, but I do appreciate the fact that we have a very comprehensive Stage 1 report. And I'd like to thank the Justice Committee once again for that report, and indeed the clerking team for the effort that they have put in, as well as all of those who gave evidence to the Justice Committee. I want to try to spend my time, Presiding Officer, just addressing some of the areas and issues of concern raised by members. I've taken a fair number of notes on some of those concerns. A number of members, Rhoda Grant, John Finney, Rachel Hamilton, Liam Kerr, all raised issues around the interaction of a DAPN or DAPO with other court orders, particularly relating to children of the person against whom the order is made. So, to be clear from the offset, it is a criminal offence, as the bill highlights. It's a criminal offence to breach any terms of a DAPN or DAPO without reasonable excuse. The fact that a contact or residence order was in effect would not change this fact. It would not prevent a DAPN or DAPO from taking effect. I know the committee's view, and a number of members have articulated it, that provisions should be made on the face of the bill, making this absolutely clear. And I will give careful consideration to that recommendation. However, I would need to ensure that such an amendment wouldn't risk calling into question provisions in other legislation where this issue is not explicit in the face of the legislation. As ever, I would like to just ensure that there aren't any unintended adverse consequences by such an amendment. I should also say that it is not unusual for courts to take into account child contact orders when perhaps imposing other orders, such as an exclusion order or indeed a non-harassment order, for example. In terms of interaction with any other requirements for a person against whom a DAPO or DAPN is made to remain at a particular address, again, a number of members referenced the issue of home detention. I think Rhoda Grant mentioned it in her opening speech in particular. And I did address this issue during my evidence session at committee, and the answer, in a sense, I think is quite straightforward. If the police consider the imposition of a DAPN as being necessary to protect a person at risk of domestic abuse, or indeed the court considers a DAPO as necessary for the same reason, then they may well impose a DAPN or DAPO. This may affect existing conditions a person is subject to, i.e., to stay at a particular address as part of the release on home detention curfew. Where a DAPN or DAPO is imposed, it will then be for Police Scotland to ensure that that information about this new development is passed on to the relevant agency. For HDC, that would be SPS, the Scottish Prison Service. For release on licence, that would be a local authority supervising officer and Scottish ministers. So effective operational engagement will clearly be needed, and it will essentially be for those authorities, the SPS, or indeed for the local authority supervising officer, to make a determination that whether or not that individual can remain on HDC or within their licensing conditions without a recall, or indeed whether the circumstances of the imposition of the DAPN or DAPO merit recall back into custody. However, I will ensure that this is an issue that is discussed, government-chaired implementation board, but I do not think it is as complex as perhaps some members.
I'm a teacher, Mom.
I will continue. I also noted a number of members wish to make the point of extending powers, or potentially extending powers, to other organisations to make a DAPO, or to apply, I should say, to the courts to make a DAPO. In particular, local authorities and registered social landlords, they will often have to respond to domestic abuse cases, and there could be cases where it would be helpful for them to apply for a DAPO on behalf of a person at risk, rather than having to approach the police. I know the Justice Committee have indicated in their report this is something which could be considered at some point in the future, and I agree, if the bill is passed by Parliament, it's something which could be considered in light of experience of the operation of the scheme. Going to some points that were raised by a number of members. John Finney raised the point, and Polly McNeill also raised the point, and Rhoda Grant raised the issue of what of the suspected perpetrator, and whether more than advice and assistance should be provided to them as per the recommendations of the bill. And I have listened carefully to views on this point. I do remain of the view that the provision in this regard is appropriate. My concern would be that if we were to impose a further duty on social landlords, then they may be reluctant to use the powers that this bill provides. And of course, existing homelessness legislation does place a duty upon local authorities to provide support and accommodation to those presenting as homeless. John Finney made the point that he was concerned that police were effectively being given the powers of a court of law. I simply have a fundamental disagreement with him, and happy to take that disagreement and conversation with him offline. It is because we are so concerned about the ECHR implications of any DAPN that there is such a narrow and short time scale by which a police officer has to then apply to the court on the next court day for a DAPO, because precisely for the reason that we believe judicial oversight is required for such significant powers, and that time scale is so short. But again, I'd be happy to take those issues up with John Finney. Rachel Hamilton asked about DAPNs, how would they be issued in practice? And again, I'd refer her to similar provisions in England and Wales, where the majority of protective orders are issued at a police station. Although I take the point, of course, that in some cases, an individual would not be compelled to go to a police station, may refuse to go to a police station, and therefore, of course, police could then return to an address and issue an individual with a DAPN. If that individual was not at their address, then of course that is not an uncommon situation for Police Scotland, and they would use their powers necessary to track down that individual. Rachel Hamilton also asked about financial abuse. That does come under the definition of domestic abuse. However, if and ex-partners, I should say, are also covered by the bill. However, if of course the individuals are living separately, that may be an issue, and therefore it may be that this particular protective order is not the correct remedy to that situation. So all in all, Presiding Officer, this has been a good debate, a helpful debate in terms of understanding from members where their main concerns are. Look forward to working with those right across the chamber to address a number of these issues. But I have no doubt whatsoever that regardless of the concerns that individual members and their parties have, that we are all absolutely united in ensuring that police have every tool possible to help tackle the scourge of domestic abuse, which is a cancer in our society, and one, I'm afraid, that has been of great concern, particularly during this lockdown period. So I commit to work with members right across the chamber, to work with operational partners, to work with victim support organisations. I'm happy to move the motion in my name, Presiding Officer, and look forward, as I say, to further engagement on this matter.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the debate on the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill. It is now time to move on to the next item of business. The next item of business is consideration of motion 23959 in the name of Kate Forbes on a financial resolution for the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill. And I now call on Kate Forbes to move. I now call on Kate Forbes to move that motion. Moved. Thank you very much, Minister. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 23997 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on a Stage 2 timetable for a bill. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now, and I call on Graham Day to move the motion. Minister.
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No member has asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 23997 be agreed. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 23972 on approval of an SSI. And I ask Graham Day, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move and speak to the motion. Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I speak in relation to the protocol between the Government and the Parliament around COVID-related SSIs. This particular SSI modifies some of the restrictions on international travel by removing Namibia, the United States, Virgin Islands and Uruguay from the list of exempt countries in the international travel regulations. They also amend the review period for the international travel regs and the information regulations to 28 days. They further amend the exemptions for essential government business in the international travel regulations and add exemptions to, for TV production, journalism and the performing arts to the same. These regulations came into force on the 19th of December 2020 and I move.
This motion will be put at decision time. I am minded to accept a motion without notice to bring forward the decision time to now, and I invite Graham Day, Minister for Parliamentary Business and Veterans, to move that motion. Graham Day.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. The question is that decision time be brought forward to now. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. We now move to decision time. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion 23983 in the name of Humza Yousaf on the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill at stage 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. We move. The second question is that motion 23959 in the name of Kate Forbes on the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Bill financial resolution be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And the final question is that motion 23972 in the name of Graham Day on approval of an SSI be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. That concludes decision time, and I now close this meeting.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.